Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the couple who were here yesterday. You missed a very good day, and we had an intriguing and interesting day yesterday with various speakers. And we've got 3 guest speakers today. I'm going to start off this morning. The first thing I'm going to point out is that we have taken the trouble to print some certificates of attendance out, and you'll get them at lunchtime. And we've done a booklet with the seminar notes in, which you can take away with you at the same time. I'll repeat what I said yesterday, which is that all the materials that you've seen on the slides and on the videos yesterday and today will be available on the website probably from Monday, whenever Martin recovers and gets around to putting it up.
Well, a couple of people asked me to by the end of next week.
Yeah, we'll have it up next week sometime. So all of you that registered, you can just go on, log in, and only registered people can get access to that part of the website.
Or the FTP, Rudi.
Sorry?
The FTP.
No, I'll be on the website. I was asked by 4 different people yesterday if we can distribute the list and contacts of all the attendees, and I'm a bit unsure about that. Is there anybody that really doesn't want their name distributing to all the other people at the meeting? Okay, we will distribute it next week then. That's if you want to come. We are setting up something on the website. I'm not sure how it works. I'm not an expert on it. Where you can talk to each other on the website, a bit of a social media, a bit of like Facebook, but just for the seminar. And we're hoping that this has generated enough interest that we can carry on dialogue afterwards. So we're hoping this can be an ongoing thing. There was a definite mood towards positive action yesterday, I think. And I am going to end today. I haven't figured out how to do it yet, but we're going to word a resolution that we intend to send to the various trade associations, bodies, the HSE, with a suggestion of the conclusions that this seminar has arrived at the end of the day. So if anybody's got any suggestions for that, please let me have them during the day. As we've got 3 guest speakers today, I'll be circulating quite a bit, so I hope to have a chat with you all today in the breaks. Right, we're going to start with an overview of erection of structures, some of the issues. I'm going to sit down while I do this. I have chosen this at random. I don't have too many photos of stages. The work that we do with stages tends to be analysis and things for clients. They don't tend to send us the pictures. So we do get some, but we don't have as many as we might. This shows quite a small stage with a very large load in it. And they didn't ask permission to put any amount of weight in the roof of this stage at all before the event. Now, it was 10 years ago. But it did, when I saw the picture, it did remind me that when I went on site and actually saw the stage, well, bricks were involved. Turned out they've got 2.5 ton up there and had no permission at all to hang. Oh, Martin, can you see about getting this light out? Sorry, we turned it out yesterday, didn't we?
It's going to be a case of trial and error, I think, but...
Yeah, okay, mate. Thank you, Chris. So, we have got more on stages later on this morning, so I'm not going to dwell too long on stages. This shows a typical stage built on scaffold with light beams and timber decks on the beach. And it's rather interesting that I can't see a lot of bracing in there. There are cables there, but they appear to be only in the bottom bay, and they've put the cable sheets in first, which does seem to be very poor practice. And once again, the pictures are several years old, but it does show if you don't control things that it will happen. This shows a polygon stage on a smaller stage, and this one's with the stage on the ground, open front, and it doesn't appear to have the anchors all the way in if you look at the bottom right-hand side down here. And it looks like there's only one anchor in that corner, and yet the whole roof's up. So I'm probably telling 90% of you how to suck eggs here, but these are the kind of inspection things you've got to watch for when you're on site and you're examining. I wanted to show you this one. Don't know how well I can do this. There we go. When I examined this one, it's got the normal scaff underneath, system scaff, and then light beams, which are an aluminium beam with a timber insert. And the lead plywood on the light beams, and they weren't screwed down. Just wedged them together. And the base plates weren't clamped properly. Can't see it there. Can't see it there. So, and as this was on a beach, we ended up getting 6 skips, rubbish skips, and a bucket with a teleporter. And filling the skips with sand.
Cheers, mate, thanks.
And strapping them down to the roofs. Now, I'm going to go back. There we go. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of when we put them on, but if you imagine to the right there, we put 3 skips that side and 3 skips down the other side, and we strapped them in line with the column. And if you remember, Simon showed you a picture yesterday of an aluminium truss leg with a ratchet strap down to ballast, and it was halfway up the leg. I see a lot of this happening not just with trussing but with marquees. And portal frame marquee is basically a shape like that. And the maximum stress in the whole frame is around the top of the leg. So if you then get a strap on it to pull it out and stabilise it, you're actually inducing failure. So if you want to stabilise the marquee properly, you put a cable from the top of the leg to the top of the leg, and then you can pull it out as much as you ever want. So it doesn't mean you can't put straps on and ballast and stakes, but don't over-tighten them. So that is the secret. If you're going to stabilise a marquee frame, put a strap on, down to an anchor, and just take the tension up so it's holding it rather than tensioning it, because if you pull it, you're actually inducing failure like that. And trussing's the same. Put the strap halfway up the leg, all you're doing is asking the leg to buckle. I'm going to move on to big tops now, I think. This shows a lot of people are doing this now. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this erection technique, but you do have to watch the weather conditions when you're doing it. And what they use is the massive power of the teleporters and the fact that the tents are so strong now that it will take this. To do this 15 years ago would have been suicide. You'd just rip the whole end of the tent out. And you'll notice that there's all the side poles on here. It just shows the absolute massive, massive strength of the large structures nowadays. Because there's about 3 ton of side poles hanging off that tent while they're lifting it up. Nothing wrong with it at all. But we have, if you remember I mentioned briefly yesterday, we've got this period of instability from it being on the floor to being fully hoisted and tensioned. And that is the danger period when you're erecting and when you're inspecting. And this is good because it minimises that by doing it quicker. It minimises the risk by actually speeding up the whole thing by a factor of about 3 or 4. If you had to do it one by one and put the poles in one by one, it would take you a lot longer. So although it looks... I've had people comment on this before, and I thought I would deliberately bring this one up and mention it. This is a screw anchor going into the ground. We're going to come back to this later. We've got a whole section on anchors after this first half-hour period. And Alan's going to go into the technicalities of soil conditions and what to look for. And I'm going to go into theory of anchors. It's not an extravagant theory, but it's an important theory. This is 3 acres of tent laid out, and the only thing you have to watch when these really big tents are laid out like this is if they get filled full of water. We mentioned briefly about water yesterday. If you had 10 mil of water laid over the whole of that, there'd be 30 tonne on there. And of course, you couldn't possibly lift a tent. And if it rained for 3 days, you might miss the gig. Now, we never have missed the gig. There are ways of doing it. You can inch the necks up. Oh, there's the anchors again. This picture is purely to show that somebody's built the stage too close to the roof. Membranes move in and out. So there's upwards of 300 big tops like shown in this picture of at any weekend in the UK, every summer, every week of every summer. And we try and give them at least a metre clearance. There is a big issue, is that depending on the slope of the ground, often grounds are twisted. Homeland used to be a classic one. It was like a skateboard track. The roof can move up and down nearly a metre and still be tight. It's not because it's loose, it's because it's following the contour of the ground. And one of the things that we check when we're doing design and analysis is whether the roof is compliant enough to take these shape changes. This is testing, and I'm mentioning this once again, is to do with ground rather than anything else. These are 2-tonne blocks going on a 30-metre truss. The truss weighs 1.8 tonnes, and we eventually put 38,000 kilos on there, as you can see. And then we put 16,000 kilos on the 2 king poles. So there's 50 tonne there on 2 poles. So I'm talking in round terms. The base plate for that king pole is a metre square. The ground was just normal. It's East of England Showground at Peterborough. So it's just normal, run-of-the-mill place, grass, clay, soil. And the base plates didn't sink more than 55, 60 mil, with all that weight on them. We hadn't had any rain at the time, but we thought they might go down a foot, and they didn't. It was most amazing. I'm just showing you some unusual structures. The issue with this one is the issue you have with a lot of unusual structures. There's a lot going up there and not much holding it down. The only holding down points on that structure are the 4 corners. So if you ever get to a structure you see where it has lots of big arches and lots of open space on it, you've got to make sure that they're held down properly. Because you've got a big surface area and not much to hold it down. And those holding down, it's not an issue. I'm not trying to make an issue of it. But the holding down force at the few holding down points have got to be much bigger than if you had lots of little ones, obviously. And one of the reasons the traditional marquee works and the traditional big top work is because they've got lots of small gaps between the poles, the guys, and the anchors, so that you redistribute the load through much smaller, a lot more smaller points. And if you have large marquees or modern membranes and you've got these big catenary arcs on them, with no anchors in between, the ends of the arcs become vital that the anchors are firm, because they're doing the job of 10 or 20 on a traditional marquee. There's another one. You can see there's not much holding that down. 3 points at each corner. Each of those points would have to take about 10 or 12 tonne. So you're looking at 36 tonne downforce. And bear in mind, this is all because of factors of safety as well. That's not the actual 60, 70 tonne is not the uplift. It might be near a 20 or 30 tonne uplift. Right, we move on to seats. The only issue with these seats, there's nothing wrong with them at all, but there's no spreader plates on the ground. Now, sometimes that doesn't matter if it's inside a tent, because you're not likely to get any rain in. But I think in this day and age, and then once again, these pictures are several years old, and I picked it deliberately because there weren't any. I had to look hard, because all the other pictures I've got with seats have got timber spreader plates underneath them. But there's 2 ways of doing it. One is to put them on timber blocks, and the other way is to use straps like this, which locate the A-frames and stabilise the seats. And the principle here is much the same as all stages, platforms, seating grandstands. If the feet sink into the ground, the structure is no longer stable. It's lost its geometry, it's lost its bracing. It's out of control. You don't know what's going to happen to it. This vehicle, funny enough, not far from Peterborough at the Burley Horse Trials, fell on its back. They put it full of people, and the back legs, it had rained, and the back legs were soft, and it just very slowly tipped over. Luckily, nobody was hurt, believe it or not, and it was full of people as well. And that was about 10 years ago, I think. So once again, stability, soft ground. This is a platform on an old, this is an articulated trailer, folds out hydraulically, it's got a green platform on the top. I don't think this one's doing the rounds anymore, I think they've retired it. But there was an accident with this one because they put too many people on the roof and overloaded it. There are probably 20,000 of these knocking around in Western Europe. They're used as motor racing garages, they're using it as hospitality extensions on the back of trailers. They're basically half a marquee bolted onto the trailer. And if I told you how many of them I'd seen that were wrapped over the roof of the trailer where they hadn't anchored them down properly. They just literally pick up and rotate around the back and fold over. And you wouldn't believe the amount of damage they do to a £100,000 exhibition trailer. There's another one. There's an extreme example. You've got a 2-storey exhibition trailer. The roof lifts up, the hydraulic pods come out twice. A little awning builds on the front, the marquee on the back. Not too much trouble with stability with any of this, except it's all based on the weight of the central trailer. And because the trailer weighs 25 or 30 tons, I think they're not going to have any problems. But the truth is, if one side's soft, once again, the whole lot can go over. And I think it's 3 or 4 in the last 20 years I've seen on the backs. So we're not just talking geodesic domes or marquees or big tops or stages here. We're talking about exhibition trailers, and I think it was Carl, or no, it was Tim mentioned steel shields, fencing. Get Harris and put banners on it. So many of them fall over, we get fed up with putting them back up, don't we? It's, I won't bother with that one. This is an unusual one. I don't have an erection picture for this structure, but if you saw how it went up, it had a central pole, and all the outside of the tent is loose, and the whole thing's flat on the floor, and it's picked up by the central pole, and gradually comes in, and only then do they anchor the outsides. So at that point, they anchor there, 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 there. But in the meantime, the whole thing goes up like that, and it's got the roof in while it's doing it. It is the most lethal structure I've ever seen. Tiniest bit of wind and you'd have instant problems and potential for injury. Doesn't look like a lot, but signage, banners, flags, all add extra wind loading onto structures. This is just an awning on a trailer, but they've gradually added so much junk on it that it becomes a major issue. And in fact, those signs weighed 100 weight and a half each, and one did fall off and injure a member of the public. So it's the unlikely things that can often jump up and catch you. Nothing at all wrong with this picture. I've only put it in so you can see the complexity of some of these structures, the way they go up. We've got motors in here, we've got gearboxes, we've got reduction drives, we've got a complex ring which is capable of lifting some 20 or 30 tons. And they're all built in, and these things go up in hours. Not days, hours. The window to inspect them and to check them is perhaps as little as 20 minutes. Now, if you're going to do that, you need the compliance and the willingness of the contractor to help you with it. So if you're on site that day, give them your mobile phone number and say, well, we're just about to lift the poles if you want to see, or we're just about to lift the nets, or we're just about to lift them. If you want to see them when they're on the floor, come and do it now. This system of lifting the poles has been developed over the last 30 years. These masts are 25 metres high, they weigh 2.5 tonnes a piece. The motors are all built in. They're all built here in Sheffield, as it happens, these motors. And you've got 2 motors in each mast. One lifts the pole off the floor and the other one lifts the tent. The biggest issue I've seen with these motors is the cabling, which is not an issue for the public because they're disconnected when the public's in the tent, but it is an issue for workers. And we have slowly improved working practices on that one recently. This is an extension of the very first picture I showed you where we're lifting the outside of the tent up. You can see what it looks like with only, you've got a big sail, and it is actually reasonably safe because you can see the straps are all on and they're attached to the anchors. So it wouldn't go a long way if it did move. But it just points out that you have got this period between it being on the floor and being in the air where there is, the risk heightens at that point. And I'm going to come back to hazard and risk in a bit. And the fact that the risk is managed well and successfully shows how well it is done in this country at the moment, because I don't remember ever having an issue with this. So I'm pointing it out as a hazard and being risky, but I'm not saying that there have been big issues with this. We're not trying to make an issue of that. Further away picture of that one showing how they lift. See with the cables? They need to be built in and fastened to the mast if you see loose cables. Here's the motors again. Beautiful piece of work, if I do say so myself. That's a 9-ton winch. I think Carl might be interested in that one. I'll have to send. Twin motors, reduction gearboxes, twin chains for security. We've got motor brakes on them. This shows the big steel fittings on the outside of a big top. Obviously these have to be bolted together properly, otherwise the membrane can split at the perimeter. Back to down. Right, one more. This shows a 25-metre frame being lifted with a teleporter. This is intrinsically risky. It's intrinsically dangerous, but it happens week in and week out at showgrounds and festival sites and events up and down the country. And there are so few accidents they're not worth mentioning. So the problem is obviously self-correcting, in that because it's dangerous and because those hoops cost about 2,000 quid per unit, you're not in the habit of dropping them. But if you do drop them, you do real damage to them. And at that point, they've got to be checked before they go back up. And every now and again, somebody drops a hoop. See it further up. It does rely on the skill of the forklift driver to pull that up so you don't put any strain into the hoop. And the reason is that that particular teleporter probably didn't have enough reach to do that job properly. The angles are quite short and you'd have to keep reversing to get the hoop up safely. This shows the eaves of a marquee frame. It's what I did mention earlier, it's the critical point. And if there's anywhere on there that is damaged in any shape or form, it has to be examined. Most other places on the marquee can live with a bit of a dent or a scratch, but if there's any damage around that area there, it's structure doesn't go up. This shows steel deck. A lot of people are aware of this. It's not my favourite beast, I have to say. It's fantastically useful for indoor use and for small stages, but I see too many people, I think, using it for big stages. It is dying out, the use of steel deck, I think. Daniel might agree with me on that one, don't you? So here we're putting a frame on the deck, and you see this at hospitality marquees up and down the country. If it's done on system scaff, it's usually no problem at all. On steel deck, you have to be careful where you put it. You have to be careful you're not overloading the legs. You have to be careful that you've got proper packing underneath the legs to make sure that they don't sink into the ground. This is an interesting one. This was a structure put up with concrete blocks, and it's in the process of being erected as we mention it. And obviously that solution is not a good idea the way they've placed those blocks. All you're doing is pulling the block sideways if the marquee were to impose a load on it. You're better off with the block sat on the column and the ratchet strap straight down. But what we did to solve that problem was to take another ratchet strap from there to there, and from there to there to equalise them out and sort of triangulate them, and that did the job. And there was actually enough weight there to hold the structure down. It was just the blocks were badly positioned. This shows a typical marquee. You'll notice there's no roof wires in there. There should be cross wires in there. I heard somebody mention every fifth bay the other day. It's a rule of thumb you should have at least, but on bigger structures it should be every third bay. And that is the basic cables in the walls of the roof. If you're on 20 and 25 metres, 5 bays is pushing it, particularly on grass. If you've got good footing, then 5's okay. But you end up with an enormous sideways load on your plate, and the stakes can slice the grass. Here's a cassette floor system. Nothing wrong with them, except that once you've got the floor up, the marquee sits on it as well. So you don't just have the floor loads, you have the wind loads on the flooring. And if they're not shored up and chopped properly, as a rule of thumb, whatever the bay width is, you should have a block every half a bay. So if you're on 3 metre bays, you should have a block every 1.5 metres. If you're on 5 metre bays, you should have a block every 2.5 metres. They look nice when they go up. The boards are dovetailed and they slide into the aluminium grooves. And usually, as a rule of thumb, if you can crawl underneath it, it's too high. Give you an idea. Cassette floors don't like being up in the air a long way. They're not intended to be used as a stage. They're only intended to be semi-self-leveling. So you get more than 300 to 500 mil in the air, you've really got to start looking at them. Here's a small marquee. Once again, they've erected the frame. They've put the erection bars in, but they've left the erection bars in and not put any cross wires on it. So once you get your first bay up with the erection bars, your second bay should have the cross wires in it. So it's stabilised. Erection bars are very strong in tension and not that good in compression. So if the wind was blowing from one way, you'd be okay, but not the other. Sorry? Are we on time? No, yeah. Okay. All of these, with some additional notes, are going to be on the website after the seminar, and we're going to expand on them bit by bit over the next few weeks. So if you have any questions at all, let us have them, and we will not only respond, but tell you where they are on the website to look for them. I'm going to move on to the next section now, which is Stability and anchors. I'm going to hand you over to Alan for the technical side, and then I'm going to talk to you about the practical side of putting anchors in.
Hello, morning. Rudi was talking there about Harris fencing. The little aside about that is that the best way to put up Harris fencing is to get somebody drunk to do it. Because the more out of line it is, the more secure it is, the longer it will stay standing. Maybe an extra half hour before you have to go and get it.
Right, you're now going to dress on it?
Yeah, we have seen several people arguing between adjacent sites as to who owns the Harris that's scattered over both of them. So, oh, right, is this going? Oh, this is going. Excuse us again.
What's up?
It's going automatic.
Oh, right, yeah.
There we go. My friend, BSCN 13782. To my knowledge, this is the first time that anchors have been included in a standard. Details of how you calculate it, there's always been advice and guidance and bits and pieces, but it's in a standard. It only deals with simple anchors. A large circular piece of steel driven into the ground is what it deals with, but at least it gives guidance on how you calculate. So I'm actually going to put a formula up later. Sorry about that, but it had to be done. I'm an engineer. It talks about two different types of anchors, as we were talking yesterday. One to use weight, and rods. It does say all the other stuff, any other kind of anchor, the kinds you actually use more often, you have to seek specialist guidance. But luckily, that's available. For those who don't know what we mean by weight anchors, this big lump of something. We had water, we had sand, concrete, steel plates are used, skips, as Rudi said, lorries, in fact, as well, big trucks. Anything that's heavy, hold the thing down. They stop sliding because there's friction, you would hope. So the calculation for these is quite simple and are used everywhere. When you bury them, you're not, they use the pressure of the soil to stop the sliding as opposed to friction, the ground in there. Stops the block from sliding and the thing works well. That's only if you know what the soil is. If you've got some information as to the strength of the soil. If you know that it is proper soil, it's not made ground, it's not been somebody's just dumped stuff over it and put some grass on it, as there are on lots of sites. You need to know the properties of the soil to do it, and the code actually says if you don't know exactly, you haven't got exact details of what this soil is, don't use it. Just rely on the friction on the bottom now. So why would you bury it at all? I don't know. So that's the guidance it gives for weight anchors, even though there's a huge amount of different methods. It gives no guidance on how you connect the anchors, as Rudi was talking about, which is probably much more critical. It does give information on rod anchors, complete with a diagram. So there we go. And it talks about a minimum driving depth of 80 centimetres. There's obvious reasons for that. You don't want to just drive your stake into topsoil, because topsoil will just give you no strength whatsoever. It'll just rip out. You want to drive it into the substrate, is the engineering term, just the ground underneath the topsoil. And so it's a minimum depth of 80 centimetres, which is fairly standard. But we have two different types of soils. I did years of soil mechanics, so I can tell you there are two different types of soils. And there's sticky stuff and there's non-sticky stuff. There's cohesive, which sticks together, which is clays and silts, and there are sands and gravels, which don't stick together. If you drop a bit of it, it spreads out. If you drop a bit of clay, it goes on the demo. The cohesive soils, the clays, come in a variety of forms. We have loose and soft and firm and very firm. The different types, depending, they're quite obvious. You can test that with your heel. If you put your foot on it and it sinks up to your ankle, well, it's not firm. The sands and gravels are obvious. They're quite strong when they're dry. They're very strong when they're dry. They're incredibly weak when they're wet. It's like driving a stake into water. If the thing's soil is saturated, they have pretty near zero strength. But the thing about cohesionless soils and water is that water runs away from them. It'll run through and down and away, and they do dry quickly. Whereas clays will hold the water, and they will get softer and softer the more water lies on it. So in the standard, they've given a chart here, and they talk about a dense, a very stiff, or stiff cohesive soil. That's a dense cohesionless, that's sands and gravels. Assuming it's dry and dense, there's the strength you can get out of our rod anchor. And then we've got stiff cohesive soils and very stiff cohesive soils. There's not a lot of difference. These are factors that you stick into the equation to get, which involves the length of the pole and the diameter of the pole. So as you can see, we were talking yesterday, but if you're on a sandy site and you're pulling at a proper angle, which is the angle you're pulling on the thing, you can get quite a reasonable strength out of it, assuming it's dry. There we go, formula. So that number on that chart is bound into this. So that ZX came off that chart, so you know what angle you're pulling at, and you know what type of soil you've got. You get this number, you multiply it by the diameter, and you multiply it by the length. So if you've got a 2-inch, 3-inch steel tube, and you bung it in, if you want to get twice the strength of it, according to this, you put a 4-inch steel tube in. If you want to get 3 times, a 6-inch steel tube. Same length, or you could double the length. These are direct. They are in proportion. So double the length doubles the strength. Double the length, it's not a function, it's a linear function. Because the way this works is they pull out a cone of soil, and the depth, and the deeper you go, the bigger the cone gets. At the top, it's a function of something like 1.5 times the length of the thing is the proper correct. So this thing underestimates the strength of long anchors by a long way. This is incredibly conservative. But it's in the guide. And this is the one that says this is what you shall do. So here we go again. It's a very, very conservative method of assessing the strength of anchors. So that's my rant over, because it's not often you get something that's in the standard that's incorrect, but I think that one is. Rudi talked about screw anchors. They increase this cone of pull by putting flat plates all the way down it, which react with the soil and give you a great deal of resistance, especially because they're done in bits. So you drive 2 meters in and then screw another one on and then drive it further and then screw it on and drive it even further. So you can get these things to huge depths. Assuming, of course, but you're not going into a really nice boulder clay, the kind that you get almost everywhere when you want to drive these things. Hit a big boulder with one of these things and it stops. Because it stopped doesn't mean that, oh, I've got it set, it's got the great, now we've got the full anchor load. It means it's hit something, it's not set like a screw has. It means you've hit something. Take it out, do it again. And this is a particular, I thought I'd better give them their credit because I stole it off from the website. These are the kind of loads that you can get in them. It's a 2.5 inch, 60mm, 8 tons. Special ones, 15 tons. 7 tons. 70 tons. That's 70 tons, isn't it? Yes. Very, very special. These are ultimate loads. These are the max. That's what you'd think it would pull out of the ground at. For the full length of them. This is spectacularly strong. And then we have these. I've just picked a couple. These are the ones that I don't know about you, but everybody hates these because they throw them away. They're thrown away because you can't get that end bit out. These are driven into the ground and then pulled back, and the plate tips and it grabs the soil. But you can't get that bit back. You have to unscrew the rod and pull it out and say goodbye to your.
Well, to be balanced, Alan, there are people that claim they can get them out, but
yeah.
The few that I've put in and tried to get out again, I always had trouble with it. So,
no.
But there are people that swear they can get duckbills back out. You put a cable on one end and tilt it back with a cable, but it is a mess.
And that way you lose not just that, but the cable as well.
Yes.
Anyway, these are very fancy, and yet again, it's not very clear, but you're into 38 ton at the very top there.
Sorry to interrupt, Alan, but this will be on the website afterwards. You don't need to write the numbers down, even if you could see it. We will make sure that these charts are available for you to see.
So, if you use these fancy anchors, if you use screw anchors, or even small helical anchors, or these are helical piles, as you can get, the great news about them is the people who supply them will tell you what they can take. A lot of them will come on site and do the test. The test is the critical. Come to that in a minute. There we go. We talked about sands and gravels. This, being technical again, all depends, the strength depends on this thing. Which, as a rough guide, if you got a whole dose of sand and threw it on a table, poured it in a pile, it would go into a little cone. The angle of the slope of the cone, it tells you how strong, it tells you how the particles interact, how they grab, the friction between them, and that gives you this angle here. And related to the angle is the strength. So to work out from first principles the strength of an anchor into occasional soils is very simple. It's the friction on the cone. You have a length and it comes out at an angle. You've got this conical area of friction. Multiply them together by a factor you get off this chart. It gives you the strength. And it's a true value because it relates, the size of the cone is related to roughly 1.5 times the depth, the power of 1.5. So it's a calculation you can do. Cohesive soils is very different. They've got this machine here and they shear the soil. Because it's sticky, they break it and they get from this highly complex triaxial test machine this value C. We got, of course, soils that are a mixture. They're not just clay, they've got clay with stones in them, they've got clay with a lot of sand in them. They call them, imaginatively, C and Phi soils. And the factors are huge. Working out the strengths involved in that is a nightmare. You don't want to do it. So it tells you the 13782. What's a bit of really good guidance, don't do it. Use the cohesion list, just pretend there's no clay in it. You're going to be very safe. But it says testing. Testing is the answer. The guideline says use a factor of safety of 1.6 on the ultimate failure. So you go out and you pull anchor out the ground and you get a value. It took 16 tons to pull it out the ground. Yes, divide that 1.6 into it, so it is rated, according to this, as 10 tons. That's ever we can go home happy. We use 2 as a minimum. If you're on a site where it's uneven, some bits are wetter than others, you've tested one in the dry bit, the wet bits are going to be less, or it's sandy over there and it's clay over there. Factor 2 is maybe not enough. You don't test every anchor because you test them to failure, or you will proof test them. You pick a number, you say I want to have 10 tons on that, we'll pull it to 12. If it doesn't go at 12, then you know it'll hold 10, but so factor of 2 is a minimum, from my point of view. And then we have testing methods. I have seen, quite literally, that somebody brings a forklift up to an anchor, puts a bar through the ring on the top into the fork and pulls the thing until it comes out the ground. You get a number, that's its ultimate failure. It pulled out at 16 tons. What does the forklift weigh? The forklift is sitting on the cone of the soil that you're trying to pull out. The forklift is sitting in the zone of influence of this anchor, and it's adding its own weight into the strength of the anchor. So if you get a really big machine, that anchor will be really strong. And if you've got a very small machine, the anchor won't be so strong. Do it from far away. Get a big beam, put it between 2 anchors and test the one in the middle. Get a telehandler and put it over there and pull on it. You have to be at least half the depth of the anchor away from it. You have to be out with that area with your test. A big tripod, you have to be outside the influence area of the anchor when you pull, otherwise your test is meaningless. This is, again, going to upset some people, I hope. Please tell us, if you come onto a site, we think it's the client, the owner of the site's responsibility to have information. If they had they had a festival there last year, somebody tested their anchors. Please can we see what they did, what they got, what the results, what the test, what kind of soil is there?
And festival sites are big, so you need to know different areas of the site.
Yes. And if it rains, where does the water lie? Where does it drain away quickly? Are we in the wet bit? Please no. So it's a wish list, and we think it should be available everywhere, because most sites had a festival there or some sort of thing there before, and people tested. Please tell us. So that's my rant over. Rudi can talk about the practical side of it.
Well, actually, I'd like to go back over one or two of the things that you've done. And these formulas are all very well. How does the contractor put this into practice? Is the question. We're looking for guidance for people that aren't sat there with a scientific calculator working it out.
These are design formulas, so people will design the length of the anchors to suit the load that they know are going to be on it. And these will be supplied to the erectors as they have to test the anchors to provide a minimum value of. And this is the information that we should be provided and will be provided. It's part of this communication. It'll be in our technical handbook, what the anchors should be tested to, what they need to provide.
Can I ask a question?
Certainly.
Is there a direct correlation between how hard it is to get a stake in and how much resistance that stake then has? Question part 2, doesn't management to stake is smooth or ridged, or if you're using rebar or a straightforward tube, whatever, does that make a difference as well?
The friction on, if it's not smooth and you get friction interface between the soil and the pile, is better. Yeah, it does. It increases it. It gives you a better resistance. It grabs into the soil better if it's not smooth. It can be smooth. It just is not as effective. The difficulty in driving it to giving resistance, no, it's not. The difficulty in driving it can very often be the matter of gravel, sand in the mix of the soil. Making it hard to drive it in doesn't mean that it's hard to pull it out.
In our experience, it actually seems to be the case. You spend 20 minutes on a fire station and not long trying to get it out.
Yeah, well, that, as I say, doesn't necessarily mean it does. It can be, but you can't rely on that. Yes, but you can't rely on it because it's what's happening down there you can't see.
The question I have is an easy method of determining in advance what is the soil type, and how does the client find that out without spending thousands on getting a lab to test it?
There are simple tests. There's a really good way of doing this. If you're using a complex anchor, they'll come and test it for you. They have what they call a standard penetration test, where they just bang a cone thing into the ground, and they note how many hits they have to give it for it to go in a certain distance. And when you've got that information, that tells you the properties of the soil in relation to its anchor strength. This is a cheap thing to do, and it's effective.
Surely that's something bang and safe.
No. No. Well, it's a very, very small area on the end of the device, and it's not affected so much by the particle size as a large stake. You can't rely on the variety of a big flat stake going in, whereas the standard penetration test is done usually with a hole. Dig a hole, drive the thing into the soil there, increase the hole, drive the soil in, drive it in. There's a modern method that they use which is banged in the back of a Land Rover, where they insert a probe into the soil and can give you strengths from that.
Is it an optimum angle to the pin and the cable that's connected to? So what angle should the pin drive into the ground? Vertical angle, away from the tension?
The 13782 says that short stakes should be driven vertically.
But all the pictures we've seen of the marquee, they're in an angle.
Yep.
So what's that for the short stake?
Around about the 80 centimetres.
If you buy frame tents, the stakes come in 6, 8, and 600 mil, 800 mil, and 1 metre. So 800, anything under 800 is 2 foot, is classed as a small stake. Big tops go up to 2 metres.
If you're driving in an anchor for a very high loaded cable from a big tent, we reckon it goes in line with the cable. A screw anchor should go in line with the cable.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you
yeah.
do you mean you follow the angle of the cable? Into
Oh yeah, very much so, yeah. You don't angle the screw away, it's got to be in line. It's the way it grips the cone better. A normal driven peg, the traditional way of putting it in, and I have to say I have no reason at all for saying this, but I still prefer to put the stake at 90 degrees to the tie back. It seems to hold better over the years, but the guidance says you put them in straight.
This to my mind is super critical stuff.
Yeah.
This is the absolute basics of what we need to look at on the site to say good, bad, indifferent. And if there's kind of some dispute as to whether the stake should be angled away or vertical or angled to, with screw anchors I take completely, that's a different deal. But with a standard smooth, 800 mil peg, I normally would expect to see it at least at some angle leading away from the tent, because then you're using some of the shear force in the soil rather than straight pull out. So, is that right? I mean, surely there is a right.
It is right, because what happens is the stake pulls and compresses the soil in front of it.
Yeah.
And you need to angle it away so that when it's compressed, it's at least still vertical. Colin?
The main reason you wouldn't put them in vertically is the ratchet or rope would slide up the stake. You have to have that angle to lock it off away from the big stuff, otherwise your tension will come off.
I'm playing devil's advocate here because it does say, it says should be driven, if optimally it should be driven vertical, but it's not.
That would be, Alan, probably for the best holding of the anchor, but it wouldn't secure the marquee that it's going to hold up to it.
No, the answer is,
the same with the screw jack?
what has been done, no, screw piles are completely different.
I know they're completely different, but the point of a screw jack is that, while we can all test them, 2 days after, if it rains for 2 days after you've tested, the ground's completely different. I always like to put a really big, solid railway sleeper, big angle iron, something that you can visually inspect every day. You can't see what a screw jack 14 foot under the ground is doing.
It is valid what Colin's saying, because he's probably put more of these giant stakes than anybody else in the history of tents in the UK. He's thousands of installations over the years. And at Glastonbury, let me tell you, and Luke and the guys from Glastonbury crew will tell you here, when it gets wet there, we put railway sleepers and we bang them into the ground, and we don't even put a point on the railway sleeper. We use a normal fence knocker and they go straight into the ground 8 foot down, well 7 foot down. And we've done it time and again when it gets, that's how wet the ground gets at Glastonbury. And if you don't put them in, you lose the tent.
Last thing.
We've never lost the tent, by the way.
We had 3 railway sleepers in a row in Glastonbury, and they were moving afoot. Every time the wind hit the tent, they were moving, all 3 tied together in a row.
It's at the bottom of a dip, and all the water runs down into it, and it becomes, well, everybody's seen the pictures of the quagmire, but you try holding giant structures up on that, it's really difficult. So if you imagine the cross-section of a railway sleeper is probably bigger than the cross-section of that iPad, and we're knocking it straight into the ground with sheer force and no point on it. It is amazing when you see it, and it goes in like a knife through butter too.
As I said about screw jacks, the really great thing about them is they go a long way down.
Yeah.
And if you go a long way down, the fact that it rains, especially if you're into some sort of clay, cohesive soil, water's not going to get there over a weekend. You've got the benefit of depth.
If we had our way, you would not use anything other than screw anchors.
Please.
I was still really confused about this vertical staking business. I mean, it's so counterintuitive to common sense. How can it possibly be stronger to have a vertical staking against it?
We're not advocating that. Alan's telling you what the guidance is.
I'm telling you what it says, and I don't agree with it. No. As I said when I'm looking at it, I think it's wrong, apart from anything else. And I think that guidance is wrong. I think the practice has shown that you don't do that. You put it in at right angles to the angle of the wire that you're connecting. Yes?
Could you, just again, another simple thing, I know what I like to see, but maybe the benefit of folks who don't come across this very often. What about when you're double and triple staking to the point where a stake is appearing to pull and you go and double and triple stake? We saw a photo on Simon's presentation yesterday of 3 in a row that were roped across, and I would have that as an example of bad practice, because actually the 2 additional stakes are not holding restraint, no matter how tight the rope is, not particularly good at restraining the angle of pull of the guide. So what would be an acceptable way to do it? When would you accept seeing another stake laid between those 3 to act as a kind of, to pick up the force between the 3 stakes? What should folks be looking for, and when should they be saying, hang on a minute, that doesn't work, or, oh great, that's a good solution, you've doubled up, you've tripled up on stakes here, that's the configuration we want to see. I mean, I think this is this is the kind of real basic stuff that I think as inspectors of tents we should know about.
Yeah.
That maybe totally second nature to everybody else. I suspect that some people might be going, geez, yeah.
Well, there's 2 answers about this. There's the technical designer answer, whereby it goes into interacting cons and all that.
I want the muddy feet answer of what I
Yeah, and then there's the real answer, which is what's actually done, which we've all seen when they connect them together. Rudi, you go.
Well, the photo you saw yesterday that Simon put up showed what you have is 2 stakes in the ground, and you put another stake behind them, and then the 3rd stake balancing on them 2 like that. And there's actually nothing wrong with that, and you do get triple effectiveness, provided that you take account of 2 issues. One is the stake, the 2nd and 3rd stakes have got to be far enough apart not to be pulling on the same bit of ground. So you're not getting triple the effectiveness, you're still in the same holding cone. And I've put a diagram up here, Alan, which I'm going to show you in a second. But the reason I didn't like that picture yesterday is the bar going across barely reached. And it only needed to move a tiny bit. And it could move sideways. I'm not saying it would move sideways, but it could. So something with rings on it or lugs with holes in to put the stakes through would be preferable. But there's actually nothing wrong with the practice of increasing the effectiveness of a stake by putting 3 in instead of 1. But don't imagine you've got 3 times the pulling power. You haven't. You've got maybe 1.5.
So could I ask that maybe with the notes that come from the end of the conference here, that somebody yourself, Rudi, or Colin, or someone who's got the experience can actually just do a thumbnail sketch to say good, bad, allow this, don't allow this, or if it's done like this, make sure this point.
I think we could do that, couldn't we?
Certainly.
For you, it's second nature, but for us, these are critical decisions that somebody's got to make.
And we have got a table of standard anchors. It was taken from the time when I was working on the IFAI tent rental committee. And they use wooden stakes in America, which we just don't allow over here. The reason you don't allow wooden stakes is if they're brand spanking new and you're using them for 1 weekend. And they actually tend to grip the soil a little bit better than steel. But you don't know what condition the wood is inside if you're using. In the old days, they used to use wood stake, round wood stakes like a big pencil with a steel ring put over the top to stop it from shearing. It's just not acceptable anymore, any more than wood timber with bridge bars. I'm going to show you this. This is what Alan was explaining about the holding cone. This is a small stake example, but the ratio works no matter what. I don't know if you can see, this is a 3D model showing the 2 cones, and we've got a metre deep stake, which is the white one, and a 1.5 metre deep stake, which is the blue one. And the diameter of the 1 metre stake is 1155 mil, and the diameter of the holding cone of the 1.5 metre stake is 1732. But if you take the volume of the 2 holding cones, the difference is 3.37. So you've got an increase of 1.5 in the length, but you've got an increase of the effectiveness of 3.37 minus the amount that holding cone is sticking out of the ground, which is why you need to go deeper. So actually, it's still more effective because the small one is still above the ground too. And we've taken a typical 45-degree tie back here.
This is the thing that I was explaining, or I was glossing over, because the formula in the code ignores that. Ignores that entirely.
Well, it ignores the bit that's above ground.
It ignores the fact that the cone gets bigger as you go deeper. It says it's linear. It says that if you double the length, you double the effectiveness.
But you don't.
Well, you don't. You multiply it by 4.
And previous experience, photographic evidence, everything. If you pull a stake out the ground and the soil gives rather than the stake or the tie back, it pulls a big lump of soil out with it. And that's what we call the holding cone. And I agree with Tim, this is crucial, and it doesn't matter if it's a stage, if it's a tent, if it's a stay on a piece of steel shield, they all rely on anchors into the ground. And Alan's suggestion is not a silly one, I don't think. I've never heard anybody suggest it before. But why don't we do tests on sites that are used year after year and have historical data? It makes so much sense, and it's so cheap and easy to do that maybe we ought to start asking for it. If we all collaborate and say it doesn't matter which contractor goes in this year, he makes the soil data available for the next year, everybody's going to benefit. Are we done on anchors?
Can I just
Carry on.
I mean, I'd like to think that would be the best case, nice idea, but unfortunately, in my experience, when I've asked for
there's no reason why they can't provide that information without prejudice. Say, this is as we believe it
It's
is.
an indication.
We can't guarantee this is the truth, but this is what other people found.
And if the organisers insist that the contractors provide that data, and tell the contractor that it will be used in future years, there's nothing anybody can do about it.
Yeah.
Possibly, yeah. Maybe we just need to, once again, I mean, we know how to do this. Go on, Tim.
Yeah, sorry, me again. Two things. Firstly, I would dispute the fact that it should automatically be presumed that it's the promoter or the landowner who's responsible for this. For sure, on big festivals and repeat gigs, yes, there's a duty of care. We've done it here. We should know. But, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Medians who rented a tent for their daughter's wedding, why the hell should they do a soil survey? You know, it's up to the contractor there to come and establish whether or not they're bringing suitable and sufficient kit to hold it down on that rental site. It's not really up to, Joe Public member to do a soil analysis. They wouldn't have the first clue. They wouldn't know the zone of influence if it bit on the arse. Yeah, so the contractors can't say, oh, well, it's entirely down to the landowner, it's entirely down to the client. Because I simply don't think that's either fair or results actually in a good technical analysis of what the situation is. So in some instances, yes, you can reliably go, here's the question, what's the soil like? But that means that we also need to be comparing like with like. So could I suggest that contractors here, and if any organisers here, when we do a soil test, it's not like, oh, that's a little bit crumbly and it smells when it's wet. But, how much does it take to pull out an 800 mil stake that we hammered in 750 mil and we pull vertically? It's the standard test procedure. We just agree what size and shape of thing we put in the ground and how we try and pull it out. So the data is meaningful.
No, but the soil conditions are what vary. The stake doesn't vary, the screw anchor doesn't vary. Given ideal conditions, we know what a screw anchor will take. We don't know what the soil conditions are.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that
what Alan's saying is, if you have historical data on that site, it will give you a better understanding, not all the answers, a better understanding of what you're working with.
I know, but that's what I'm saying, you get a standardisation. So, you might do a test on a screw anchor, but actually the next week we've got a marquee coming in that's going to put 800 mil pegs in. So if there were a standard test that, Glastonbury did, what would be the most useful peg to try and pull out to give us a standard data for whether it's Bellersfield or wherever it is on the site? Shouldn't we just agree that we'll all test the same thing so that the results in Somerset make sense to the people who are coming from Yorkshire?
Can I add to that? I think the real thing is there's so many different variables. The best thing to do is proof test it. Just do a pull test. But before you put your tent out, pick 4 locations and pull test it and say, right, I know that this stake holds X amount, and say, now for safety factor, okay, this single stake isn't going to quite cut it, let's put 2 stakes in, 3 stakes, brace properly, and we'll test and prove it.
So as a contractor, you're taking all the liability and responsibility there, which I love.
But the contractor,
I'm not
hang on a
saying
second, the contractor has got the liability anyway.
Yeah.
Or
I'm saying it helps if you know.
I can't expect
Yeah.
the person to pass it on to the information they've done for the guy next year, because ground conditions have changed, and it's money that he's put in to do that test. Why should he pass that on to the person next year? That's not his job.
we're talking about 2 separate things here. One is,
Yeah,
go on, John.
From a promoter point of view, the problem is we want somebody to give us a price to put the tent up. If you come along later and say, oh, sorry, we mispriced it because we need screw anchors, so I think there is I think the promoter, certainly on bigger sites, should probably be providing information, because otherwise, how the hell do you price it? Otherwise, you've got to go to every site, every tent contractor we've got has got to go on site and do a pull test and find out what kind of anchors they need, so that they price it properly. The point I was going to make, which isn't that one, so just a promoter's point, there is an app called iJob, and I just wondered if anybody got any experience in using it, British Geological Society. There's an app you can get on your iPhone. It locates via GPS where you are. It tells you where the boreholes are that have been commissioned and publicly available near to where your sites are. I just wondered if anybody got any experience in this room of having used it.
Yeah, briefly. It's not the app necessarily, it's the data that's not that reliable, because obviously a borehole 20 yards down the road can have completely different application to what it's got.
Unfortunately, I worked on a site where they had boreholes all the way along the line of a very large sewer, just off to the side, And at one point they were 800 millimetres away from a rock face underground. To when they dug down for the actual drain, it wasn't in the soil that the borehole said, it was in rock. Cost a fortune. But borehole information is very, very, very useful information if it's where you actually, exactly where you are. You can get the guidance if the whole area is a flat plain like you get up at Balado, then it's pretty much all going to be the same.
What is useful in that instance, as far as tender act is concerned, is you're finding it, and what that will show you is whether you're staking with 60s and drops or whether it's on the granite.
Yeah.
The rest of Scotland, Yorkshire, that's really, I think, that's really enough.
Anchors are a complex issue. It's why we've put a whole session on them today, right? And just from the comments, you can understand that there is confusion over it because the soil varies. You can't have a standard set of anchor tests anymore than you can have a standard wind calculation. It varies across the country, and anchors vary with the soil.
The point I'm saying is,
so,
if somebody has real difficulty in that corner of the site putting a tent up because the ground is really wet, it makes sense to tell the people who are pricing, as you say, next year, there's a problem over there. The guys put anchors in and they got this, and so you should know that.
It gives the contractor advance warning that there may be issues the following year if there was the previous year. And Daniel is absolutely right. You do have to do a representative sample pull test if you want to know what the structure will hold. And when we get more and better assessment of these, the way that screw anchors work, and we learn more every year, and there's been no, bear in mind, there's been no major funding on this, we just do it as we go along. There's no research. Maybe we ought to find some way through the university or something and have tests done and hopefully get some grants to pay for it. And that would help us all. But in the meantime, screw anchors work. They're so much more effective and they're not that much harder to put in. A lot of people are using mechanical knockers to force these anchors into the ground. And once you're doing that, you might as well just drive a screw anchor in. It's just as easy. And the final thing is, two small screw anchors at 90 degrees to each other with a cable looping them together is way more effective than one. And we've never done any tests on that, because you increase the holding cone by a vast amount. So there's lots that could be done on this. We could have small screw anchors that were driven in by little engine-driven, basically nut runners like you would use on a lorry wheel. You could use that to drive screw anchors in the ground and be way more effective than a 1 metre marquee stake. It's way more effective to put screw anchors in the ground than it is to use water ballast, or concrete, or sand, because a screw anchor will weigh 100 kilos. It'll hold down as much as a whole skip full of sand. The efficiency and the reason people don't use it, they don't understand screw anchors. So yes, there is more work to be done on them. We've been working with them since '96. The only help we get people like Colin and other clients, Gearhouse in the old days, and Cayenne guys, who all learn and experiment with it. And what we have learned with it, and there are companies that do a lot of research on this, aren't there? You know, some information is available, because if you notice, the post office put tie wires on their telegraph poles, and they're all held in with screw anchors in the ground, just the same as we use. And the post office have a lot more information than we have. And I have tried to talk to them, and they won't talk to me. So, but I'm sure there are things that we could do to answer your question, to learn more. There are standard charts for ground anchors. There's no argument about that. There are charts. But they basically say, in average soil, what is average soil? We come back to Alan's complicated formulas, which I'm trying to find an answer here of how we determine what is average soil. And ABC, who are the big anchor makers, have got a chemical test now, and we are discussing this with them. And if you have done one of the reasons it would work with Alan's historical data is if you have known historical data and you chemically test the soil with a simple plunger in the soil and test the chemicals, they tell us, and it sounds like black magic to me, but they tell us, they can tell what the soil will hold just from the chemical content of the soil.
Well, not on the surface, surely it's got to be shoved down.
Well, it's got to be shoved in, but it's only a hand-driven probe. They've got a little briefcase-type kit that you open, it's amazing. And they've got a bit of computer software that feeds in the information and tells you what the anchors should hold. But still, I recommend doing tests, the same as Daniel said. There's nothing to beat doing physical tests. You know that.
When you say about doing the test, using your own figures, how do you get telehandler to test 16 tons, especially the distance out?
How we test 16 tonnes is to put an A-frame on.
Right.
And you take a cable back to 2 other anchors to test that one. So you use the anchors to test themselves.
You can, use other anchors to test the middle and put half of
And the A-frame takes your bearing pressure away from the holding column. But it's a pain. It's a messing about, but you have to do it. It's not as easy as just put the telehandler out there and giving it a pull.
Yeah.
But Rudi, there is a system out there with screw anchors which do a pull test and give you a printout on each one they put in.
Well, once again, it's the same as testing in concrete. If you've got nice, fresh, new concrete with an expanding bolt or a chemical anchor, you can afford to have a pad either side of the bolt and pull it in the middle. But with soil you can't. The area that it pulls is so much bigger, you've got to move away from the anchor.
But there is a system there. I ain't saying it's right or wrong, but there is a system.
Does it have a tripod?
Well, an engineer knows far more about it than I do.
Uses the torque that they apply to actually twist the pile in.
Yeah. We started using that in '98 on Tensile 1, and it works. It gives you an indication. It doesn't give you the kind of thing you can take to the bank. It doesn't give you the kind of thing that will keep an insurance company happy. It's giving an indication of what it will hold. It's not actual figure. Daniel hit the nail on the head. The only way of checking an anchor is to do physical pull tests up to its factor of safety, not doing it slow.
If you use torque to test it, it works fine if it's in a nice clay. But if you've got a big boulder in it and one of the paddles hits a boulder, then the torque shoots up.
But there is a visual indicator on the side of the, if you've got a torque meter on the side of the hydraulic motor, and it's a great idea, and we use it. I'm not knocking that at all, and it's a very, once again, the same as historical data, it's a good indication of what you're going to get. And as all these good indications build up, it gives you a confidence that the anchors are going to do what you want. But at the end of the day, there's no better way of doing than physical tests. And, 1 in 15, 1 in 20, if any of them fail, you then go down to doing 1 in 5. And if more than 1 or 2 of them fail, you go down to test every one. There's no way around it.
Two questions. The first one, I didn't quite understand your formula. It didn't make any sense to me.
You want me to go back to that?
It makes no sense to me either. It's in the standard. And it's wrong. As Rudi said, it was the code.
What do you get out of it? I mean, what do you put the diameter and the length in? Is that an easy
This chart here gives you this ZX, this factor. So if you, this is the angle,
Is that kilograms or
it's in kilonewtons. Let's see, where's the picture? There we go. So that's your angle of pull, this beta here.
Yeah.
So you put your angle of pull in here, it's at 30 degrees, and you're in a very stiff cohesive soil, which is there. No, we'll say it's just a stiff cohesive soil because it's at 9. This thing ZX 9. You go to the formula, you put 9 in there, 9 times the diameter, which should be, I don't know, in meters, I think it tells you in the code, times the length, which is in centimeters, and it gives you the output in kilonewtons. It's there, but it says it's times this length, and it's wrong. The deeper you go, the bigger the code gets. This is a very simplified version. It's in the code. And so if you put a 3 metre long anchor in, this gives you an answer which is half.
Perhaps allow us the lowest common denominator and safety factors. Surely that's the safest way to go. Okay, as an engineer, building exact numbers, it's wrong.
Yeah, it's a very, 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 very safe guide. in terms of...
It's not wrong in respect, it's safety in mind, but it's not exactly...
well, yeah. So it doesn't guide you to the fact that being longer is better than being wider. According to that formula, it's just as efficient to make that an 8-inch as opposed to a 4-inch tube, other than being 1 metre long or 2 metres long. So if you've got a bit of 8-inch tube lying about and it's a metre long, you could use that instead of a 4-inch tube, metre long, and you get twice the pull. Well, in actual fact, if you made it 2 metres long, you get a much better factor of safety in reality. So I think it is, yes, it's a safe answer, but it doesn't guide you the right way.
Also, doesn't matter. It fails to show how important it is that the stake goes in far enough.
That's exactly it.
How many times have we seen tents, marquees, etc., left by the contractor or provided for us to look at, with actually 40% of the stake still hanging out the floor? Because they go, oh, it's really hard to put in. You know, lads have been twatting away on that one for 20 minutes. Oh, it's never coming out, mate. You just told us that is bullshit.
Yeah.
Actually, there's nothing to do with how hard it is to drive it in, but we'll accept, you know, half the stake hanging out the ground. So
I said, if you were in a really nice clay, which is absolutely all the same everywhere, it's the perfect piece of clay, it's been preserved, wonderful thing, and you drive it in and it's hard to drive it in, and then it's going to be stronger, difficult to pull it out. If you're in soil that we all know, which has got bits of stone and patches of sand and big lumps of hard clay and softer clay, and it's a very varied thing, the fact that you drive it in doesn't guarantee that it's going to be harder to pull it out. It gives an indication. Yeah.
Sorry,
doesn't guarantee it.
Your name? Abigail, of course it is Abigail. Just 1 second. You know, back when I was doing all the muter stuff in the early 90s, I suggested we should paint a coloured ring on every marquee stake. So like an 800mm stake has a ring 800, a yellow ring 800mm from the end. A blue one is 600 and a red one is... And then you drive it into the ring and you can still see the ring. And you know how deep that stake is, and it's the only way of knowing if you walk around and examine. And I've never heard anybody resurrect that. Muter decided not to do it because it was too much trouble. Right? But it's just a perfect answer to know put on smaller structures. Abigail.
Well, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on marquee pegs and marquee base plates, because often we see when there's a big change in level that the base plate is half a metre above the ground on lots of plywood spreaders, and if you've got an 800 peg, it's only going a few hundred mil into the ground.
Not good practice.
No, but what would you say was the maximum height above the ground that that base plate could be?
There is no fixed rule, but what you can say is that reducing the depth of the stake in the ground is not good practice in any case. If you have to, you need to use a longer stake.
It's a ridge on the side of the building.
Yeah,
Let's go back to the holding column. If you put 4 stakes in a marquee plate that's got 4 holes, it's all acting in the same bit of soil. You might as well just put 2 longer ones in on the outside, and it would do the same job.
But it's the horizontal load on the side of the marquee that's putting the stakes and bending.
Oh, I see what you mean, sure, yeah.
It always looks to me to be completely wrong that marquee builders often argue that it's okay like that. I wonder whether there was any sort of views on how far above the ground the marquee base plate should be.
Well, typical marquee stake's 30mm diameter, isn't it? So you've got quite a bit of shear there. Whether it bends in the soil or not, and is the soil strong enough, and does it slice the soil?
It's not bending in the soil, it's bending from the ground to the base plate.
Can I point out...
I quite agree with you, that's wrong.
We've all been that involved with this, we've run over on this session, and our coffee and tea and biscuits are going cold out there. So can I suggest we have a break and pick it up after the break? 10 minutes, 15 minutes at most, and then we have our next guest speaker. And we will have time at some point to pick some of the issues up with this again if we need to. Thank you.
Get the chair this time. Sorry. the sharing option. Do the sharing. And go off the sharing. Only once.
Good morning. I represent Serious Stages, and we've been building covered stages and temporary buildings and specialist structures for since 1985. We currently sort of construct or involved in the construction of approximately 400 large structures in different parts of the world, about 200 in Europe. The rest are in Australia and the Middle East, where we have partners and do a lot of work. There is a high range of variety in the different areas as to how wind management and the structural certification of those structures is undertaken by the local authorities. I mean, recently, last December, we designed and built a 150 metre wide by 40 metre high screen in Doha for a Vangelis concert. Initially, they were asking Abigail, who is our checking engineer and structure engineer, to design it to 38 metres a second, which was going to be a bit of a challenge. And eventually we did a plan that came to 20 metres a second, which was quite effective. But their concern was they were trying to build a temporary structure as similar to a permanent structure. In Australia, we built a range of stages for the big day out, which was a slide which I think we had before. There we go. And this is dealt with differently, and again, the different states of Australia. Parts of Melbourne, they're again looking for 36 metres a second. Most of Australia is looking for 20 metres a second. The interpretations, again, within the various countries as to how they wish to deal with the reserve factors, how they wish to deal with the ballast and the uplift and what they're prepared to look from the ground, vary enormously. But when you come back to this country, it again varies phenomenally. You take Scotland, they do it extremely well. They have engineers who go very thoroughly through all the calculations. They come and inspect, they discuss with the structural engineers prior to arriving on the site. When you're on site, they come and visit you, they go through it all, they inspect it all before they sign it off. That's a very coherent way of dealing with it. That's quite rare. A lot of other local authorities often seem to just want to have a piece of paper saying it's okay for their files. And that degree of interpretation, I think, is a major problem to how we supply stages and structures. I mean, recently we provided something in Orlando, which was for the Festival Republic. That was a 25 metre, I think it was 20 metres high, was it, Kenny? Something 20 metres high. They actually said that we were the first stage, despite having a vibrant staging and entertainment business, we were the first stage they had decided to look at for 16 years. Now, they just presumed that any stage that arrived in Orlando was okay. Now, obviously in America, there's been several problems recently where there's been, very sadly, fatalities caused by structures falling down. So it seems amazing that they've only just woken up to the fact that someone else should look at whether the staging structure is safe other than themselves. And we were very pleased to say that our system did pass, hence the pictures you see there and the show that went forward. As I'm sure Luke was, who's sitting in the audience before us here. Again, I'm sure, I wasn't here yesterday, and I believe there were discussions about how other areas and other countries in Europe handle this. Germany has a very efficient system with the TÜV. You submit your calculations to them, they analyse them in great detail. When we had to do a tour going through Germany, they actually came across to the UK, they inspected our manufacturing facilities, they looked through all our records of the maintenance of our equipment, they checked that all the welders had the right qualifications to achieve the work, they made sure that we were having the metal tested in the right way. It was incredibly thorough to ensure that we were providing the right system in the right way. They didn't leave anything to chance. There is obviously cost to this, but as I believe you might have heard yesterday, I don't want to repeat things you've heard already, but once you have a stamp and you have a proof book, then once that book goes to the area in Germany, or the Bundesland which you're working in, or the city, all the local engineer has to do is look at the proof book, check the stamps, and look at the drawings and make sure you have built what is in the book. That's all they have to do. So it's just done once very thoroughly, and then it can be transposed across the whole country. It would be lovely if we could have something like that over here to get some consistency. The HSE, under Gavin Bye, has set up recently a working group to try and look at some standardisation, and he's tasked Graham Bull within that organisation to pull these areas together. And in conjunction with colleagues and competitors, we're endeavouring to look towards something which is going to make our products, I think, clearer and virtually a stamp of approval, a voluntary code of practice for certain companies that makes our offer to potential clients much clearer. Something I feel that we should do, because when one's talking about wind speeds, I don't know if people in the hall here use stages at the moment, whether they're truly aware of what wind speeds their stages are designed for. Because it's a very, I think, confusing area within the Institute of Structural Engineers and their demountable structures guidance. They're saying the structure has to be suitable for 25 metres a second, as I'm sure we all know. But within wind management policy, you can reduce the loading by removing sheets. Now, to me, it seems extraordinarily strange that you have to remove sheets for the effective wind speed at which the show can perform. Without exaggerating it, one could say that one could remove sheets at 10 metres a second, which would mean that you then don't have a stage with any sidewalls on it, maybe any back wall. If the wind often comes with rain, the stage is actually unusable. So what one's saying is the structure will be there at 25 metres a second, but it stops being a usable stage at 10, 12 or 13 metres a second. And I feel that we should look towards, as an industry of providing structures, to provide a structure that is fully sheeted, fully operational, up to an effective working wind speed. And this is something for discussion amongst my colleagues. But 20 metres would seem the lowest, it's what's used in Germany, but we're in a higher wind area than Germany, I think would be fair to say, Abigail, in some parts of the UK, so we might need to look at 22. I mean, obviously there are factors which I'm sure Abigail will explain, or might have been explained yesterday, as to how you look at whether it's an exposed or partially sheltered or fully sheltered site. This becomes very confusing to, I think, our potential clients, and I think that we should be offering stages that are usually built in quite exposed places to a high wind speed, correctly ballasted and structurally in structural integrity. And it's one of the conversations which, as I said, having brought some more people up, I want to open up for discussion about, because that's the main thrust of what I feel we should be doing, is trying to standardise a product between all the companies that are offering it that we can offer to our clients, our mutual clients, with some degree of uniformity, because I believe that at the moment it's a very unclear picture that is being presented to potential users. I mean, the other factors which I don't think are taken into account, particularly which is certainly being brought up by the HSE, is the training and the skills level that are endemic in our country, in our companies, and how uniform they are, or how they can be assessed. And obviously maintenance records, as there's high degree of concerns in America with the aluminium towers, is how much maintenance these are received, how often their welds are tested, die tested, and the maintenance records are rarely asked for. I mean, I've never had them asked for in 30 years. We keep extensive maintenance records for our equipment, when it was manufactured, when it's been inspected, when it's been used, how many times it's been used. So they're available, but we've never been asked. So again, it's completely reliant upon us turning up with equipment that we say is okay. We built it with people we say that's okay, that no one checks in any way, shape or form. And then we produce calculations relating to a bunch of criteria. In some cases, we're aware that, again, with the lack of uniformity, some staging companies at the current time are offering their calculations on a out-of-service roof. So it has no rigging or rigging loads in it. Therefore, that's not quite the product that is then going to be used. And I think that this degree of confusion is something that needs to potentially get resolved. So I wanted to discuss those points, and I wondered if we could have some questions on that, and whether we can open that up, and maybe Tim, you could say a few words on what you think, having been in America recently, talking about the same sort of subject, particularly with regards to how bands are starting to put these things into their contracts as well.
Never shy of saying a few words. Sorry, is there a specific thing you want me to talk about?
Yes, I was thinking about what's going on in America and how they're trying to standardise that.
Yeah, in the States last year they had, I believe, in North America they had 5 collapses of ground support aluminium stages, resulting in 12 fatalities. One of them went over.
Tim, I think people are going to struggle to hear you at that point.
It's the mic just there.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, that's the blimey, I get to speak. I know what I'm saying. In the States last year they had, in North America last year, 5 stages went over, killing 12 people. In Italy, a ground support stage went over indoors this year, killing a crew member who was a student working on his first show. So a lot has happened, and we've seen some of the ghastly pictures. And that has kind of prompted, really, in the States, a bit of a spasm of introspection, and they are, I think, largely looking to Europe to set, or to use as a template for establishing some kind of criteria for the checks and balances that we have become quite accustomed to. So, for example, the presence on site of someone who inspects the infrastructure for an event, whether that be the stage, the water quality, looks at traffic management and that kind of thing, it is radically different to the system that we're used to having here of public event licensing. Yes, the 2003 Act has got huge problems with it, and they've tried to, take the intention of shoehorning us into late night burger stalls and regulations about, nightclubs and so on. It's different doing outdoor gigs. But nonetheless, in the States, there is almost a complete vacuum, and certainly no continuity from state to state. So there is, as we speak, an initiative called the Event Safety Alliance working there, trying to get some distance towards kind of where we're at. But I think what's been revealed in the room here over the last couple of days is that actually, even within our own sector, which we'd like to maybe think is kind of spearheading the world in terms of good practice and conscientious approach to doing this, actually, even on the simplest of things, how do we put a stake in the floor, what angle should it be at, and how do we tie off to it? We still may have some ambiguities here that we're not quite decided on. And the other thing that's occurred to me over the last few days really is the degree of confusion, misunderstanding, misapprehension, failure sometimes even to think about the issues associated with the handover of legal liability right through the supply chain. If I drew an analogy with the supply of temporary structures for use on a festival site, I draw an analogy with the use of a vehicle that you go and rent from Hertz. Yeah? If I go to Hertz to rent a car from them, I expect a couple of things. I expect firstly that Ford Motors, who manufactured it, have designed the car to be inherently safe. The wheels won't fall off. There's enough oil in the reservoir, to lubricate the engine, and the hydraulic system has got the right fluid in it, etc., etc. So the designers have a very clear legal liability to design, manufacture, and supply to their purchaser a product that is entirely safe for normal use. Right, okay, so Hertz go and buy a fleet of these Ford cars. It's then up to Hertz to make sure that the car is inspected, maintained, that the tyres are pumped up to the right pressure, that the oil has been changed, that the fluids are topped up. You get where I'm going with this. You then go and rent the thing. And there's a point of rental where you sign that triplicate document, which I guarantee most people have never read the small bit on the back of. But you're signing to say, I now take liability for this, and I promise to drive it safely. If you crash the damn thing because you don't drive it properly, you can't blame Hertz, and you sure as shit can't blame Ford. And we're in an analogous situation. The designers of structures have a clear legal duty under the Provision and Use of Work Equipment regs and the Machinery Directive and all the rest of it to design, manufacture and supply to market things that are inherently safe. there is a separate set of liabilities and duties then that fall to the suppliers of those structures, not the manufacturers. The suppliers have got their own duty to carry out scheduled maintenance, to make sure that their crews know how to put it up, to make sure that they're putting it up in accordance with the manufacturer's statement. And let's face it, for a lot of these things, there ain't no manufacturer's statement how to put the damn things up. You just have to work it out somehow. And then I think where the most ambiguity falls is when it comes down to the operator, those of us that are running gigs. So if I draw an analogy, I'll give you the driving thing, but let's go back to the reality of temporary structures. When it comes to it, on a stage, calling a show stop, getting the band off, or going to the client and saying, we're going to have to pull this, it's going to cost you 10 million bucks, you're going to have to give everybody their money back. That is a really serious and significant call that is made under extreme pressures of time, extreme pressures of stress, and you are only doing it because the shit has hit the fan. And these are not easy decisions to make. And those kinds of decisions don't tend to be made by Stephen's crew chief. You know, it's not the structural provider who's going to come dashing on stage and say to the actor, listen guys, it's all going wrong with the sheeting at the back, you've got to pull it. If somebody else does that, it's usually the stage manager, it could be the band's security rep, it could be any number of other people who take responsibility for that critical judgment to go, guys, this is going to break, you've got to pull it. With all the clients that Tess are lucky enough to work with, we've actually discussed these things. They're unpalatable and difficult things to talk about, but we have got some routines. And Professor Republic got a simple thing, like, we printed plastic credit cards which say show stop on it. This person is authorised to stop the show. Because if you try to jump on stage and stop Beyonce, the chances are the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to wake up in the back of a police van. You just don't get up there and say, it's all off, guys. So it's only when the end user starts looking at these difficult, unpalatable and horrible decisions that actually we start getting, we get to the reality of those. And I think everyone here needs to be sure where they are in the supply chain, that they've asked the right questions down the chain of their supplier, and that they make the right statements to the people that they are supplying their service to. And sometimes it's really horrible, but you've got to make some really difficult decisions. Yeah, Mike, sorry, I've got a bit more.
I think just going to your analogy about car from Hertz. I think in present climate, it'd be lovely to go hire my car from Hertz, but actually I might hire my car from Georgie's van hire on the high street, and that van may not be up to the standards that Hertz is up to. In terms of temporary structures, if you want to standardise it to 22 metres per second, you can see lots of products out there that are 17 metres per second that will do a job on a budget. And I think if you're going to try and standardise it, then the smaller stage, the smaller marquee supplier, smaller fabricated tent supplier, all need to fall in line, otherwise we'll end up with a really good section of the industry standardised, and then the small van hire company on the corner of the high street coming up with something else which will meet the budget of the local authority events on this. And I'm afraid that's a real situation.
That's a very good point. Again, if you come to Germany, the Germans have a lower standard for smaller events and smaller shows. So they have one standard for major events and a different standard for smaller events, because they accept that smaller event to be stopped at a lower wind speed than a larger event, where there's obviously less people in a smaller event, which seems a very coherent way of dealing with it.
It has to address the consequences of a high wind event. So
Yes.
if you've got a very, very big main stage that you can't de-sheet, it has to be designed for, can you hear me?
Yeah.
It has to be designed for a high wind speed. If it's a much smaller tent that can be de-rigged very easily, then it's a completely different thing. So there's a certain amount of judgment.
It is, because one of the things I was going to ask you to ago was the slide that says it at all. It's just the difference in various wind speeds and how much more
two different numbers, one going up and one going down, so the net difference is quite small. So it's a reasonably small amount of gas to withstand about 25 metres a second. If you go up to 30 metres a second, you need tons and tons of ballast. So it just doesn't really work. So this is why structures and wind speeds are limited to that figure, really. And I think it's the fundamental. I mean, if you're on a greenfield site and you can put huge anchors into the ground, then you can go up to a much higher load.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the other aspect that concerns me, and I was going to jump over this one, he's lurking, hiding down there. Come on, look at that. Is to do with if there is a wind management policy and we're having a policy for removing sheets, how easy, with your experience, is it removing sheets from a large structure if the wind is 18, 19 metres a second?
Virtually impossible.
So it's almost when you see things that say we're going to remove our sheets at 16, 17 metres a second, it's virtually impossible. It's very dangerous to do any activity like that. It usually involves going out with a knife and trying to split yourself off some cherry picker, which again is then being used beyond the wind speed that is recommended by the manufacturers. So it seems very logical to have a wind management policy on removing sheets, and when it's so practical to do so. And the other factor is that one hopes the wind is not blowing the whole time, and the object of the stage, in our case, is to have a show. Therefore, the moment the wind goes down a little bit, you want to get the sheets back in to enable you to have a show. It's very difficult to do that.
Yeah, wind
Getting back in even worse.
Yeah, the first thing is, one of your big problems is, on the bigger shows, you're going to have to go to a band manager, project manager, whoever, tour manager. First thing he's going to say is, you're not taking the sheets down,
Yes.
because I've got my rig up there, and you're going to ruin it.
Yes.
So you're in a no-win situation. They probably even look at the wind speed they're working at. When you go out and do a tour, you do the engineering, have to go and do the engineering, it's all there, they won't look at it. First time they're interested is when you're saying, you've got to do something about this, you can't carry on.
Which brings us back to the situation management with this gentleman there, by his hand.
Sort of moving forward with what Tim said, it sounds like a stage should be judged based on its sort of capacity and the risk associated with closing it down. So wind speed can be tied to that. So say you've got a tent that's this big and it has 150 people capacity. The risk of that, the difficulty evacuating that and that sort of thing is quite low. So you can have a lower wind speed factor on it. Whereas a bigger stage, like say sort of massive event stage, it needs to have a higher wind speed factor, a wind speed associated with it, because you've got 10, 20,000 people in front of it. So you need to, that should be part of the design for a stage, is to say, what's the evacuation difficulty associated with it. Does that make sense?
That would seem sensible. Would you agree with that, Tim?
Yeah, I mean that is the process of risk assessment. A risk is the hazard times the consequence. For a basic, that's my formula to put on there. What's the likelihood of it going wrong, and what are the results of the thing falling over or failing? What is most difficult though about this issue with cancellation and the wind policy is that you must always make that decision before it's definite. You've got to clear the tent before the damn thing has reached its design wind speed and fallen over. There's no point in waiting for that to say, God, yeah, my gut feeling was right. We should have gone out 5 minutes ago, shouldn't we? So there's always going to be a ferocious amount of pressure from the promoter or the organiser to keep going, which is quite understandable. It's not that they're rapacious, bloodless vampires who are solely out to line their own pockets. Well, not all of them. So there's a very difficult set of decisions that need to be made there when it's not absolutely crystal clear that it's going to be too much wind or too much rain or whatever. That judgment has to be made beforehand, and that judgment has to be made by designated grown-ups, in the right circumstances with the right data. Whether that's data from the anemometer whizzing around on the top of the structure, or the data of the fact that you can see the things beginning to shake to bits, and you can hear the rattling of lighting safety chains in the roof, and you're thinking, this isn't good.
Do you want to just mention what you were saying about the stage in Ottawa and the stage in Vancouver and the problem that you had there?
Yeah, I need to be a little bit careful because I'm relating stories here that I wasn't directly involved in. But there's a gentleman called Dave Frey who is the tour manager for a band called Cheap Trick. And Cheap Trick played a gig in Ottawa last year, and they were on an aluminium ground support type stage. And the wind came through and it blew it over whilst the band were on stage. And it was only, literally, I'm not making this up, it was only because their backline truck was parked directly behind the stage that the masts fell against that backline truck and kept the band alive and kept Dave Fry alive. You know, the thing literally came down around their ears and they were saved by the fact that the masts fell off the truck. A couple of months later, you can imagine, that's a change of trouser moment right there. That is not a comfortable thing to be involved in. A couple of months later, the band were playing in Vancouver on an identical stage supplied by the same contractor. And again, the wind was, howling through the rigging to the point where backline techs and others were saying, well, we can't really, we can't keep the drum kit upright, sort of thing. And Dave, quite understandably, looked at this, considered what had happened to him on an identical stage a few months before, and said, I'm not putting the band up there. He is now personally being sued by the promoter and others for, lost earnings, consequential losses, because he pulled the gig without due cause. Now, one of the things that I'm hoping to do in the work that we might undertake with the Event Safety Alliance in North America is to come up with a protocol, a route map for decision making in those dreadful circumstances when it's all beginning to go wrong. The promoters looking at, losing tens of millions of dollars, people looking at losing their lives if you don't make the right decisions. You've got very little time to do it, and you've got to make a decision. You can't phone a friend. But if we had a route map for decision making that was bought into by the enforcing authorities, that was bought into by the promoters, the venue, the bands, their agents, and critically the insurance companies, so that they say, okay, if you pulled the gig and you went through, decision loops A, B, C, D, E, and then you take you to Z and K, if you've done those things, cancellation insurance pays out. If you cancel because you didn't fancy it, or because there were wrong crusts on the cucumber sandwiches, the artiste couldn't possibly go on, well, that's not kind of going through the right protocol, and insurance for cancellation doesn't kick in. So these kind of simple protocols, I think, could actually enable two things to happen. One would be to stop people getting killed because nobody's got the bottle to get up there and say, let's pull it, which is really, I think, calling a spade, what happened in Indiana. And secondly, what you might get is a bit more clarity for the legal liabilities and the disentanglement of the civil actions that result afterwards when someone has made a difficult decision for all the right reasons, and they then have to defend that in court. I mean, the fact that Dave Fry, as a tour manager and production manager, is now looking at having to go to court to defend himself for trying to protect his life and that of his band strikes me as just horrifying. But this is what's happening as we sit here. So I think providing a route map could be very, very useful. And, let's face it, gravity, wind, etc., they've got it in the States. I believe we've got the same sorts of things here. So we should, in our own minds, and with our own clients and with our suppliers, be talking about this sort of route map. Because there's no point in, in ringing the designer. There's no point in ringing the designer when you've got 30 seconds to pull the band and get them off and make the announcement to the audience or whatever it may be. You need to have that route map.
Shouldn't we actually be, I agree, but it should be unacceptable for stage roofs to collapse, actually. That shouldn't be happening in the first place.
I absolutely agree, but a roof collapse is a conjunction between metal, wind and God. A roof collapsing onto people is a failure of management, and that's something we really can get to grips with. Now, it's not that I discount, that roofs shouldn't be strong enough to stand, of course they should be, but roofs and other stuff falling onto people and killing them, whether it's flying Harris fencing or a ground support stage coming down and hitting people, well, that's a failure of management. It's not a failure just of metal. It's a failure of us to organise our gig in a proper way and respond. The management of the health and safety at works regulations requires you to have a plan for response for clear and imminent danger. And that's a mandatory condition. There's no, so far as is reasonably practicable, you must have a plan for dealing with serious and imminent danger. Now, we all do fire alarm drills, we all look at the signs, we go and kick the fire extinguishers, etc. But how many of us pedantically go through a show-stop procedure or a wind and evac plan? How many times do we test those things?
Well, one of the issues that also comes up with that, Tim, is that the wind is not a cost. We along with other people, and I know Tim does it, subscribes to various
you're absolutely right. Let me raise another quick issue. What happened at Pucklepot also happened, again, a colleague in the room who was actually there in 10 or next to 10, happened at the Holy Festival. When the wind gets up and when the weather is dreadful, there is a kind of natural inclination on the part of the public to get into shelter. You know, it's understandable. Who's gonna stand in front of the, you know, Stephen's stage when it's raining cats and dogs, it's horizontal sleet, and people are desperate to get under cover? And they go into the very structures that cause them problems. So there's kind of almost 3 levels of wind plan or rain plan or shit weather plan that you need to have. The first one is, you know, it's raining and it's horrible. Let's make cover available for the public so they can get in. The next level is this is not looking too good in the Big Tent now. The Big Tent that people are seeking shelter in is the very thing that will cause them injury. Level 3 is we've now got to explain to everyone who's sheltering in here that they need to get to a place of safety. Now, you try and get in that message out when there's horizontal rain, and you're saying to people, I'm really sorry, mate, you've got to go back to your own tent, or you've got to go back to your car. I'll give you an example. In Estonia, about 8 or 10 years ago now, there was a beer festival that was happening in a city square, and a thunderstorm came through, and hail fell, you know, very sharp southern storm. 56 people died in the metro station steps, most of them young women trying to get out of the hailstorm. 56 people dead trying to get out of bloody rain. It's just unbelievable what human behaviour is like. But unless and until we start having these considerations and these discussions, then we as organisers maybe are not fulfilling our full duty to protect those folks who come onto our site. And this isn't really to do with the mechanics of structural failure. It's more to do with how we as promoters and advisors to promoters and people who cause these large conjunctions of people to come together in potentially hazardous circumstances, how we deal with them and how we make decisions as to what to say to them and when we do that. It's not simple stuff, you know.
I was just, I think we've got a gathered audience here. We mentioned America, we mentioned Europe. And we'd be really interested if we had our hands up of people that actually worked to supply and being on a gig that's been cancelled in the UK because of wind and evacuated once the audience are in. We're really interested to see how many hands go up. I have, but I don't know how the others have.
Part evacuated, not completely.
But not many.
I can help there. I seem to have my microphone back, by the way. In 1992, we had the Radio 1 stage at Reading, which is a big tent, and the wind came up, and the ground was very wet, and the corner stakes started pulling to the extent that we really thought we were going to potentially lose the tent. And there's 5,000 people in it. And we had to close the stage. That was the hard bit. First of all, bullying the organisers, because there was no procedure in place then, as Tim has just said. But they listened, and I said, look, people are going to get killed. So we got the security with a rope and walked everybody out from inside the tent. And the reason we couldn't do anything with it, that there was so many people there, we couldn't do any remedial work. We closed the stage for an hour, and then we carried on. Now, that was partly safeguarding. Perhaps it wouldn't have fallen down. Perhaps if there was a local failure, it wouldn't have caused any injury, but we couldn't afford to take the risk. And as a contractor, I preferred to fall out with the organiser. I was the contractor at that time. I preferred to fall out with the organiser, I preferred to fall out with the safety officer, and I preferred to lose the income from that gig rather than risk life and limb. And that is the attitude that we have to have.
Thanks. I think Tim refers to the management of the temporary structures. The reality is, if you set your standard here, then it's not the temporary structures that are the risk on site, it's the lighter items of event equipment that are likely to make that decision for you. Collie jobs will start flying around, hose fencing will start flying around, fencing will come down, and as an organiser, effectively, I'm going to be looking at that for the safety of my audience, not
all temporary structures are inherently unsafe. All temporary structures have got the potential for harm. They are hazardous. They are managed under risk assessment. And what we talked about yesterday is that certain structures, like, for example, Stephen's hooped stages, have a feature that is, in my opinion, preferable to ground support because it's easier to get the frame stable before you put the load-bearing sheets in. With the ground support, you have, okay, you can guide the columns out, but you've still got a period when it's halfway up, when it's not in control. And the same for a big top, the same for a pole marquee if it's in your garden. There is a period when everything's moving around and it's not quite under control. So the question is, how do we devise working methods that keeps everything under control? And even with the poorly, I'm going to say poorly designed, it's not poor design, it's poorly managed erection procedures, it is possible to devise methods of making them more safe than others. And it's really the difference between a good contractor and a bad contractor.
I suppose it's looking at historical records, but of all the structures that collapse, what's the main structures that collapse? And if you want to get that broad about it.
The answer to that from last year's evidence, Steve, is painfully obvious.
Yeah.
It still comes down to management. A lot of it is still the management of the structure. Because although you talk about the safety structure, if that structure is not managed properly the way it's installed and put up, you have still a management issue that has no effect to what Tim's talking about later on when you're there and the wind's blowing or whatever's happened and the ground's getting too soft and things starting to sink on one side. Is have all those features actually been put in to come back to management structures again right across the board because you have to be able to know what that is.
Well, was it you that was saying that the structure that we saw collapsing yesterday was designed for a really low wind speed?
They have on the reports that they put in is in the transcripts that are on both the moment, they said that it's a 25-hour wind speed, but
25 miles an hour.
25. And that they an evacuation rate is 40 miles an hour, obviously, safety ratios, and that's what the transcript said.
So their structure was only designed to take 25 miles an hour. Because that, I mean, to me, that's completely
I think it's but actually the management of that structure going up, it appears to be in the transcripts and one of the findings of part is that they didn't actually build it as per design. So where was the management structure in that process of building?
But if it was only designed to take 25 miles an hour,
That's another question.
there's been wind speeds in excess of that in the summer in the UK every summer at every festival. So I mean that's way too low.
That's another question about procurement, buying the right product, and use
Yeah.
it is, but it still comes down to if it had possibly had to be built as per design.
There has to be some agreed minimum that, main stage structures, there has to be an industry agreement. Even if it's just the UK.
To that, to basic
Yeah.
level, which is constant, isn't that constant BS standard is a requirement, but we need to actually, as you say, have a minimum standard of design, or an acceptable standard of design. We need to manage things. Again, the Olympics is having a huge impact on this because the way they're managing it, the most event industry we're heavily involved in doing work at the Olympics, is going to have an effect hopefully on the event business because of the way that they're structuring things and how they do things. Hopefully we'll have benefits from that. So it needs to be designed better, it needs to be managed better, and I think once they're constructed, as Tim says, it's down to the on-site management to ensure whatever weather it hits that structure. We've had structures fail with us over the years in extreme winds. We've had winds of 50, 55 metres a second. These are very, very high winds, so you do get damage at very high winds over the 30 years that we've been doing something. So it isn't sometimes the structure will fail at a very high wind speed, but by that stage the management should be in place. And I completely agree with you, Mike, that it's usually the Harris and the Polyjohns that are going well before our stage starts to think about it.
50 meters a second is 100.
It's absolutely, yes, it's huge wind, absolutely enormous.
I had a temporary structure in the west coast of Scotland
sidewalling sections of frame marquees or taking the sidewalling off one of Rudi's tents, does that improve or reduce the wind resistance of the structure? So we need to be absolutely clear that like dashing around unlacing stuff and wrenching it out is the right course of action.
I can give you a rough rule of thumb. If you take all the walls off, it's marginally better. It is a very rough rule of thumb. Sorry?
If you just take one side,
Oh,
it's a lot worse.
drastically worse. You just build a funnel. But if you take them all out and let the wind through, that's our experience of loading tests and wind tunnel tests.
So, this is the sort of real world, on the ground, rubbing boots data that we need to know that, if half the wall is off, it's better to take the other half off rather than try and put the first, rather than put stuff back up. I think what this forum should be able to do as an output at the end of our session is perhaps identify some of these simple key questions. What does a triple stake arrangement look like? What angle should the stake be? What's our standard test going to be? Walling in, walling out, half walling in, half walling off, whatever. We could draw up a little wee list of questions that the experts could then give us the answers to, and then everybody in the business is going to go into their next gig actually armed with some decent information to make some of these critical decisions when we say yes or no to a gig.
Shall we head back to you, Rudi?
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to thank Steve for coming all the way up. He's done it just to do this hour, and his help is here, and we'll give him a round of applause. Thank you very much again. Much as I admire you and love you very much, Tim, I find myself disagreeing with you for the second time in 2 days. You made a statement that was, it's between the metal, the frame and God. And I have to tell you that I don't agree with that one. I think we can design stages that don't fall down. I'm with Abigail all the way. What we haven't got is the willpower to build them better. We're in the marketplace we're in right now. If I designed stages that cost half as much more than what they cost to build now, nobody would hire one. And I can guarantee that stage wouldn't fall down, no matter what you did with it. We're able to build bridges that don't fall down. Just apply simple engineering standards and higher standards. So the question for the industry is, who bells the cat? Who decides we're going to build stronger, better stages that if you had 200-mile-an-hour winds wouldn't fall down? We can do that. The engineers can do it. Tell me, can you do it? You can. Right? Can we do one that's truly portable? Questionable. Can we do one that'll do that week-on-week business model? Questionable. If you go on a 2-week, you need to double your income. Who's going to pay for it? These are questions that have to be answered by the industry as a whole. It's not something that I can answer. I'm posing the question. I'm not giving you the answers. But to say it's between us and God is not the answer. We can make inherently safe structures. Whether we can do inherently safe structures commercially, we're in the position we are now. There's no doubt that Montreal, Indiana, the one on the beach in Sao Paulo, and 2 or 3 others were probably, and I'm saying probably because we don't know all the facts, caused by installer failure. So better dialogue between the installer and the inspection team and the organisers who employ them might help those situations. Okay, we're going to have one of our famous 5-minute quick breaks. Anybody wants a pee or a cig? And we'll be right back. We'll be right back with you. Slipping, but it's just gone the way it's gone. If I can introduce Gavin Bye from Health and Safety, and I'll let him do anything else from his side.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Gavin Bye. I'm head of HSE's Construction Sector Policy Unit. It's the bit of HSE's construction division that links everything we do in workplaces to all of the various stakeholders in the construction industry, whether that be Parliament through regulation and rewriting regulations over the years, whether it be through trade associations, industry bodies, whether it be through communications activity that we undertake. I have 5 teams who cover a range of different topics. And effectively take that information that we get from the industry and from Parliament and translate it into what our inspectors do. So we train our inspectors, we set their programmes of work, we set the standards that we want them to work to, that we want to achieve. Strong or too loud? Is that better?
Yes.
Right, so what I wanted to talk to you today about was where HSE fits into temporary demountable structures in the entertainment and events industry. I wanted to give you a bit about the policy background, about why we're involved at all, because we didn't used to be involved. Some people still don't know we're involved. Why we made that decision to change on policy, how the construction division works, so you know how we've worked with the construction industry and how we would then hope to work with the events and entertainment industry. A bit about what our inspectors have been finding when they've been in the field over the last work year, which is coming to a close now in the end of March. A bit about a working group we've set up with the Joint Advisory Committee on Entertainment to hopefully take forward with the industry some of the key issues in terms of safety, both of the structures themselves and of the people related to the people who erect them and dismantle them. And a bit about what we've got planned for our field work next year, what our inspectors will be doing in 2012-13. The policy background goes back to the Temporary and Mobile Construction Sites Directive in 1992, which had a specific definition of the word construction work, or the phrase construction work. It's a very wide, broad definition which could apply to virtually anything you ever do, to any kind of structure. It was deliberately meant to be an expansive definition. It was translated into UK legislation, or GB legislation, in 1994 in the Construction Design and Management Regulations, and the definition of what construction work was taken directly from the directive, so it mirrors it. HSE policy at that time was that we did not consider temporary demountable structures in the events industry, stages, tents, grandstands, to be structures within the definitions in the directive and our regulations. So they were excluded our decision was that the CDM regulations from 94 did not apply to temporary demountable structures. And that went as far as the Director General at the time of HSE writing to the Institute of Structural Engineers to confirm that position. So HSE was not involved at all in enforcement work on health and safety standards in the industry. It was entirely felt to local authority inspectors. And there was some logic to that because local authorities have responsibility for licensing legislation which applies to some events, so it was a consistent sort of approach. CDM was rewritten in the early 2000s and eventually came into force with CDM 2007. And the policy line was the same. CDM did not apply to temporary demountable structures. Peculiarly, in the 2007 regulations, there's actually a specific exemption in the approved code of practice for marquees and other similar structures, which was put in at the request of part of the industry at the time. It's a bit of an odd one because it's only one small part of the temporary demountable structures world, but it appears in the approved code of practice. So that our policy line was maintained and had been consistent over that time. Then the Olympics came along, and during the big build, we were heavily involved in the early stages of the planning of that work, with probably a lighter touch whilst the work was actually being carried out. We're heavily involved in discussions then about what would happen when LOCOG became the client and how they would manage the erection of temporary structures. And LOCOG took the decision that they wished to apply CDM principles to the management of that process. And that kicked off a big conversation between us and bits of the industry about whether CDM actually applied or not, and whether LOCOG should be doing this or shouldn't be doing this. So we re-looked at the issue again, the definition of construction. And if you look at the definition of construction in plain English, there's no question that it applies, or it covers, the kind of work that's done in the events industry. There's no question about it, it's a matter of fact. If you look at European guidance, which had come out in 2008, 2009, on how the directive should be implemented, it actually mentions a temporary seating as being an example of a structure, and therefore taking it down being construction work. So there was no hiding from the fact that actually our policy decision from the 90s had been wrong. It wasn't correct in law. But there are consequences of that. If If you then say it is construction work, CDM applies to it. The whole of the regulations apply to it. Different requirements kick in at different stages and different sizes of projects, but the regulations as a whole would apply. And with that, if it's construction work, the enforcing authority changes. Local authorities don't enforce, well, they enforce very minor parts of the construction work. The vast majority of construction work is enforced by HSE, and that's enshrined in the set of regulations. So local authorities don't actually have any powers on a construction site. Their powers are limited to those activities that are specified in the enforcing authority legislation. So those are the consequences. During that period of discussion with local, we had some informal discussions with people from the entertainment industry, people from the construction industry, and internally in HSE with our units that deal specifically with the entertainment industry about what would be the implications for us applying CDM as it is to the industry. In comparison to the legislation which existed at the time and which the industry was following, hopefully following, but which applied to the industry, the management regs, the whole other suite of regulation that applies to other industries. We came to the conclusion that CDM didn't actually provide a useful framework for the entertainment industry. It had been written and rewritten specifically for the construction procurement process. It was rewritten in 2007, and one of the aims in 2007 was to make it better apply to certain new types of contracts that had appeared over the period from the 94 regulations, things like PFI. And we felt it didn't provide a useful framework. What existed already was a useful framework, and was one that the industry could understand and could follow. So our decision was that although you could not argue that the CDM regulations applied, HSE would choose not to enforce them in this sector. But as it is construction work as defined, HSE would have to take over enforcing authority responsibility for the industry, so fall to HSE. And the decision was made that the best place to put that within HSE in terms of those people who would actually carry out the proactive inspection and investigation work would be with the construction division, because that was the industry it was most similar to. Obviously, that then has significant issues around the interface between our work and local authorities' work, because local authority licensing legislation continued in place, and that cuts across some of the requirements of the Health and Safety at Work Act. And our initial approach to it was that we wouldn't become too much involved in the structural side of the work. We were more concerned about the safety and the health and safety of those people involved in erecting and dismantling the structures. So for a particular event, enforcing authority responsibility would change during the actual process. The construction work, beginning the erection of the temporary demountable structures, that would be HSE, as it's construction work. The event would fall to the local authorities who have responsibility for licensing, and when the event finishes, the dismantling would fall back to HSE as construction work. So that was our initial approach at the start of the last work year. And I'll come back to how we've slightly changed that approach and changed our views on what we should do in relation to particularly to structural safety. A little bit now about how we work in the construction division. We've had a programme running since about 2000 with the construction industry, which at the time in 2000 had a particularly bad health and safety record. It's still not a great record, it's a lot better than it was. At the time, 2000, the number of deaths in the construction was running at over 100 per year. And in 2000, 2001, there was a sharp increase in the number of deaths. Something like a third more deaths occurred in that year, around the time of an increase in volume of work in the construction industry. And it became apparent at ministerial level. John Prescott became concerned with it as head of our sponsor department. And he called a ministerial summit in 2001 of all the large organisations in the construction industry. And basically said to them, it either gets sorted out under the current regulatory framework or we will regulate further and sort it out. And that was a real turning point in the industry. was the start of what we call the construction programme, which had 3 themes. Ownership, primarily the responsibility for managing risk falls with the industry that creates it. It's the construction industry that creates the risk, it's their job to manage it. It's not HSE's job to manage it for them, it's their job to manage it. Leadership, this needs to be both led by the industry as a whole and led within organisations by the people who lead those organisations. The responsibility falls at the highest levels of directors and managers. And one of partnership, both partnership between HSE and the industry to help solve the problems, but also partnership within the industry itself between the managers and the workers. And from that, the construction division was formed as a national division in HSE, solely devoted to the construction industry. The ring-fenced resource, with all of the aspects of HSE's work all falling within one division. So my side, the policy side, the standard setting side, the inspectorate itself, and also our specialist construction inspectors who provide specialist advice on construction engineering issues. The construction programme, which we developed in those early 2000s, was very heavily evidence-based, based on where the accidents and ill health was occurring, why it was occurring, which problems could be solved, which ones couldn't, and which ones should be prioritised first, which bits of the industry should we focus on. And it was that evidence and the design of the programme was very heavily influenced by the industry itself. I've put the construction industry advisory committee as an example. That's a committee that we run, similar to the Joint Advisory Committee on Education. But there were a whole range of ways that we interacted with the industry at a high level. The Strategic Forum for Construction, the United Kingdom Contractors Group, a variety of different groups. And they became engaged in what we were doing and had an influence over what we would do with the industry and what we would target. So it wasn't just about inspection and enforcement, but where we were going to do inspection and enforcement, we targeted it at the highest risk activities, for example, roof work, and the highest risk parts of the sectors, parts of the industry, for example, refurbishment or small sites. We had a range of approaches to dealing with the industry, not just, as I said, not just inspection and enforcement. We had communication initiatives, we had supply chain projects where we would bring together an entire supply chain for a particular issue, from the clients all the way down to the workers, the trades unions, and develop solutions with them that they agreed were reasonably practicable and they would implement, which we then backed up later with enforcement action. A good example of that would be curb cutting. Manual curb cutting without extraction, without wetting down, creates an enormously high level of crystalline silica in the air, and it exposes people to vast quantities of the dust. We agreed with the industry itself, with the clients, the local authorities, the people who procure the roadworks, with the manufacturers of the equipment, new designs and ways of working, which they agreed to and they signed up to. We gave the industry some time to implement it, and then a year or two later, our inspectors went out and enforced on it. You've seen that there's been a dramatic shift in the performance of that industry and that particular sector on that particular issue. We improved our guidance. Our guidance has traditionally been written, apologies to anybody who's a safety professional, but it's traditionally been written for safety professionals. People who run construction companies aren't safety professionals, particularly in the small side of the industry. They don't even have access to safety professionals. So we improved the way we wrote it so people would understand it, and it became much more basic. That's developed over the 10 years to the point where we now do a number of things called busy builder sheets, which tell people exactly what they have to do and show them in pictures what they have to do and what they shouldn't do in pictures. And we also updated the CDM regulations in 2007 as part of that. So that's sort of a brief run round, 10 years worth of work with the industry as to how we work with the industry. We're not just about turning up on site saying you do this, you don't do that, you don't do the other, and then leaving you with all the problems. We are about working with an industry to develop solutions that the industry can actually deliver. That doesn't mean we accept everything an industry says and just go with what they say. We will challenge where we think challenge is necessary. We will take on board the views of the industry. A little bit about what we found in the last year in our sort of first full year of carrying out inspection work. Our approach was deliberately cautious is not the right word, but it wasn't a gung-ho approach, go out and enforce, serve notices, have a massive impact. It was really about learning about how the industry works. So we gave each of our construction teams around the country a target for a number of events that they should go and visit. And we started off at the higher end of the industry. We said, go and visit these 2 large events in your patch this year. Things like, I would normally, if I was talking to this, I would put up lots of photographs of what we found to show you the sorts of things we found. We can't do that in your industry because you all recognise exactly who the people are in the photographs. So we've made a conscious decision not to shame anybody by showing photographs of poor practice. But our approach was very much that one of listening and discussing, but pushing at the same time, but not taking lots of enforcement action. Where inspectors thought they would need to take enforcement action, we asked them to refer back to the centre to discuss it first. So the visits were carried out over the year. This will be no surprise to you. The key problems our inspectors came across initially, primarily work and height, and that includes the whole range of iffy temporary work and height you would find in many workplaces. People working on pallets or forklifts, people using broken ladders, all those kind of things, but also a number of industry-specific work and height issues, particularly around the leading edges of stages and decking out of seating. Workplace transport, a particular issue. And I suppose this really reflects back to the bigger issue of the management of the overall site. Not just the temporary demountable structures being erected, but all the other things that are going on around it. So the particular issues were really around segregation of pedestrians, people at work, from moving apart. Lifting was another area. Some particularly complicated lifting activities taking place without any sort of planning. The sort of standards that we would expect in the construction industry not being reflected at all on the sites that our inspectors came to. Structural safety, that's why I put TDS. It became clear during the year that structural safety was something that we would have to address as an organisation. For a number of reasons. One reason being that our initial assumption around the fact that the local authorities had a good handle on this issue through licensing, it became apparent that that wasn't a consistent picture across the country. Some local authorities were extremely professional, had the expertise in-house and dealt with the issue really well. Other local authorities didn't have that kind of resource level and weren't able to deal with the issues properly. So it became, one of the lessons we learned was that this was an issue we were going to have to address as an organisation, decide where we sat in the process and what standards we would then expect from the industry. I mentioned about how the construction programme works. We want to, and I think we are, reflecting that approach with your industry. And one thing we've begun is a working group, a subgroup, not of the Construction Industry Advisory Committee, a subgroup of the Joint Advisory Committee on Entertainment. So it will report to them ultimately, not to Cognac. A working group that reflects the industry, so has a membership drawn from contractors, clients, designers, regulators, local authorities, both as regulators and as clients, in one case, and as a broad representative body of the industry, chaired by HSE, and all the backup and everything will come from HSE. But with that in mind, is to try and recreate in a smaller way what we did with the construction industry. We don't see the problems in terms of health and safety with the events industry as being anything like the scale that they were in the early 2000s with the construction industry. We do see things where there's room for improvement, the sort of things you've been discussing this morning, and also about the safety of people carrying out work. We do see room for improvement, and we think this is the best way to move that forward in conjunction with the industry. The structure of the way we're going to work within the working group is to have, where we've identified specific issues, we will form smaller groups of people who are directly interested in that particular issue to develop solutions and bring them back to the wider group for agreement, then promulgate them to industry, and then, as I said, we've done with supply chain initiatives future years start enforcing against those standards to make sure that there's a level playing field across the industry, people are doing the things they've agreed to do. We first met in February 2012. I'll go through the actions from that particular meeting. We were really pleased with the enthusiastic and constructive response we got from everybody we invited to the group, everyone we've spoken to the group about since and before. But before I go on to the actions from that, one of the things worth mentioning which came up at the meeting was about the HSG 195, one of our publications, the events guide. I don't know if we've spoken about this already since over the last couple of days, but HSG 195 will not be republished by HSE. The safety elements of it will appear on HSE's website in an events safety section of the website. The rest of the document has been handed over to the Events Industry Forum. It's also new acronyms I have to get used to with the events industry, for them to take forward using what we've produced already, our health and safety input. They intend to produce a much wider guide to holding an event. The reason HSE weren't able to produce a much wider guide that covered more than just health and safety is partly down to government policy at the moment, that our guidance should be limited strictly to what you need to do to comply with our legislation. So we were unable to cover those other issues that people want in order to be able to manage an event. So the EIF will be taking that forward. Before I go to the actions of the working group, a little bit about the actual terms of reference for the working group. These are obviously initial and could change if other issues become more important, and it's not an inflexible set of rules that we will stick to. We were particularly concerned, especially after our first year's experience, about that poor safety practice in particular in the dismantling and erection of temporary structures. And identifying where compliance is poor and what we can do about it, but also coming up with practical solutions to those industry-specific problems. Not just imposing exactly what happens in construction on the industry, but trying to challenge the industry to come up with their own solutions to how this can be done safely. And some of you will have experienced some of that with the work we've been doing in the current year, where inspectors have been to site and discussed things they believe that they found unacceptable during their visits. But that. But the other key thing, which was the big change from where we were a year ago, is to look at good and poor practice in the management of structural stability. And we are particularly keen to identify and to promulgate the lessons that can be learned from the incidents that have happened over the last year around the world. That isn't as easy as you would think it would be for the HSE. You think we could just phone up our counterparts in Belgium and get all the information we want. But our structure, as the Health and Safety Executive, isn't reflected across the rest of Europe, let alone other parts of the world. So it takes more time and it's more difficult to do. And in some cases, people within the industry will have quicker access to the information than we would. But we are keen that these things, the events that have happened over the last year, those lessons are learned, and the same things aren't repeated in this country. This is just a flavour of the actions from the first meeting of the working group. We've set up two subgroups looking particularly at work at height, one on seating and staging, and one on multi-storey temporary buildings, to look at the issues, to come up with some solutions. As I said, we can get agreed with the industry. We need better guidance, both for the industry and also for local authorities, so that we can work harmoniously with local authorities on what the law actually covers and what it doesn't cover. What is construction work, what isn't construction work. There will always be grey areas, but where there are grey areas, we need to be clear that HSE will work with the local authority to make that a smooth transition for whoever the particular duty holder is. We don't want people being confused about who the enforcing authority is or whether the legislation applies and what legislation doesn't apply. As I said on the previous slide, better information on recent incidents so that we can learn in the same way the construction industry has learned from disasters over the years, and not make the same mistakes. I know you've had a debate about guidance on structural stability in the last day or so. As HSE, we see the iStruct-T guidance as being the benchmark we will use during our inspection work. That's not to say that it couldn't be improved, there aren't things that could be done, but at the moment we see that as being what our inspectors will look for in terms of the management process that's followed for temporary structures. Our inspectors in the field are not structural engineers. They have access to specialist structural engineers where they might need them. They are experts in management systems and health and safety, and they will be looking in relation to that particular risk for that sort of benchmark standard from duty holders. I put as a question mark because it's something we're looking into after the first meeting as to whether we need better management guidance for the industry, perhaps going as far as a model for how an event should be managed, using the language of the industry to say who should be doing what when. That sort of stuff already exists for the construction industry, but it doesn't really for the entertainment industry. Finally, quickly, what we'll be doing this year. We have an intervention plan, LOCOG, obviously is the biggest part of the sector this year, probably. We intervened early with LOCOG and asked them to set standards for all of the people who were doing work under their control. We'll be doing sample inspections of that during the year to make sure people are doing what it was they were asked to do. Last year we asked our teams to look at large events. This year we're asking our teams to concentrate more on the next level down of events. We believe that your industry mirrors the construction industry. As a general rule, the smaller the site gets, the less expertise and potentially the worse the standards are. So we'll be looking at the next tier down. Potentially some around the cultural Olympiad work, but it could be any other events as well. Our field teams will use local intelligence and speak to local authorities about events to choose those events that they choose to inspect. The working group will continue, and we want to start delivering solutions so that we don't lose the impetus of the Olympics. It's something we've done with the industry. We've drawn lessons from the Olympics big build to share with the industry, and we'd like to do it with this as well. We'd like to maintain that impetus. And we'll be looking at what we find to really start to determine how much effort as an organisation we need to put into the industry. How much time should we be spending with your industry as against the backdrop of the whole spectrum of the construction industry. We don't just inspect people for the sake of it. We have to prioritise the limited resources we have to the highest risk areas. So after 2 years, we will have a much clearer picture of the level of performance of the industry and be able to target that much better. So our approach will evolve over the next year or two. Right, that was it. Any questions?
Who makes up the working group that you were speaking about?
Who met?
Makes up the working group? What types of people make up the working group?
Rudi's one. We have 2 local authority people. We have major staging companies. We have seating contractors, people from Muta. Yeah. So, we'll get to a stage where we can actually publish the details of the site. There are about 20 plus people in the group. I can show. I've probably got a list of the names in the document with the bag I can show you. It's as broad a church as we can get for the industry. Because there's no point in just dealing with one bit. You've got to deal with the other bit. I think the discussion I was having with Rudi before, one of the keys to improving the construction industry was that holistic approach, and in particular, getting to the clients. Because if you look at the Olympic big build, the ODA as a client took that client performance to a new level almost with their delivery part of the CNA. And that was what we would see as the key thing that influenced the high standards that were demonstrated on the Olympic site.
In relation to CDM, the HSE chosen not to enforce but still CDM standards are legally required. Do you see a time when the HSE might reverse that decision, or that CDM might be rewritten to be CDM 2000 whatever, where the events industry is taken out of it?
I think if it was rewritten, we would probably look to see if we could write it in a way that it could apply to the industry. But obviously we'd do that by talking to the industry. which I wouldn't say for certain whether that's possible or not possible at the moment, to be honest.
It has been suggested that there would be an EDM
EDM.
instead of construction events.
I mean, as someone who doesn't have much experience in the industry from inspection work, I would say, looking at the evidence the stuff that I've seen so far, what appears to me to be the crucial issue is how the whole thing is organised and who's in charge of the whole thing. Very much like a construction site. One person in control of the construction phase makes it much easier to manage. And it's that level of control is where the issue. If you don't have that control, you have problems. If you do have that level of control, you can manage it quite, the risks aren't that unusual.
Yeah. And the difference is the duty holders and the CDM and duty holder names into...
Yes. It will be force fit, yeah.
Yeah, and you can, so suppose in that force fit, you've got we can CDM and construction that can fit us as well, or rewrite. So,
I don't know if it would be weaken or not, but you'd have to rewrite it. You would have to...
Yeah, you have to weaken the duty or widen. At the moment it's quite a detailed duty holders responsibility.
Yes, yeah.
Applies to construction. To make it apply better for our industry, it means widening or loosening that.
Yes, we've been changing it so that it would cover those kind of procurement arrangements.
Do you think that's a thing that's actually happening, or we can be seen to be that close to the construction industry? Because obviously there's a lot of differences.
I would want to wait to see what comes out of the way that Locog have run the projects that they've been involved in, and what lessons we could learn from that, about what worked and what didn't work with the approach that they took. But obviously that's the top tier of the industry. So whether that would... For us in construction, our biggest problem are small sites. 3/4 of the people who die in construction die on a site with less than 15 people. Generally run by SMEs or micro businesses. So our legislation historically has been in conjunction with the top levels of the industry, because that's where the problem was in 2000 and in the 90s. Perhaps we should be now looking to write something that the small end of the industry can deal with, which I'm sure the same lessons would apply in the events industry as well.
So with your field work this year, where you're focusing on the lower tier of events, are you going to take a softly approach like you did this year just gone with the larger events, or are you going to enforce?
I think well, it wasn't softly is not probably not a good description of the approach we took this year. This year, we made people aware that there were certain things that were industry-specific issues. Think about staging, think about seating. If we find people on pallets on forklift trucks, doesn't matter what industry you're in, you're going to get a prohibition notice. So that kind of level of enforcement would continue. Around the other issues, we will be developing those solutions over the next 6 months to a year, hopefully, and then rolling out enforcement lines against that. But even where we did find those issues this year, inspectors have been pushing contractors to come up with solutions. They haven't been serving notices and prosecuting people, but they have been challenging and pushing people. Sorry, at the back.
Seems like one of your things on the area of concern is the front edge leading edge of the decking bank. If you look at the construction industry, you've got about 4 different standards where that applies. You've got guys which use full rest when they're laying for them. You've got scaffolders which work on an unprotected edge, which work on harnesses. Brickies working on scaff don't work with any harness at all. They work if they fall over and land on an airbag. Then you go to where the trenches we've dug, big trench, no protection at all. People have been talking about this leading edge, how to get over the problems, but there you've got 4 standards in the building industry. Where, how would you look at that? How would you give guidance for us to work off of trying to...
I don't agree that there's 4 different standards to start with, but the standard is the legislation. The legislation is the work at height regulations, which gives you a hierarchy of things you can do. First thing being, as with any sort of risk management process, can you eliminate the risk? Do you have to work at height at all? So in construction, that would be things like, can you prefabricate it on the ground and then lift it up rather than having people bolting it up, working in the air? But for each of those things, things like the edge protection for scaffolders, has changed dramatically over the last 10 years, and now we should not find scaffolders working at unprotected edges in any similar way to what you would have found 10, 15 years ago. The latest guidance produced by the National Association of Scaffolding Contractors limits the amount of open edge working with a harness to a very small part of the construction of the scaffold, because there are other safer ways of doing it, things like leading edge guardrails and things you can lift from below and fit before you go and work on a platform. There will be some combination of all those things that will be appropriate for your industry. We're not trying to stop people working and make it possible for people to work. We want a solution that is practical and practicable, because if it's not, it won't be followed. I don't know what it will be at the moment, but it will be something we will agree with the industry.
Yeah, because some of us have quite a lot of talk about paying for home, but it kind of just asks what would you find, because like you look at different areas of construction, which aren't there now.
Yeah, well, the edge protection and excavation should be the same as it is on a scaffold. It should be the same for a brickie. The legislation is the same. You should have edge protection at the edge of a ditch in the ground that someone's just dug. Whether you do or not is a matter of performance of the individual contractors. So I would see it as being bespoke solutions to the particular issue. But very often, and this is true of scaffold erection, the actual solution to the problem wasn't to talk about the leading edge that was there, it was to talk about why the leading edge was there in the first place, and it was there because of the sequence in which things were done. By changing the sequence in the way you put up scaffolding, you can eliminate most of those open edges. And I would imagine a lot of the stuff that's used for temporary seating staging is scaffolding type material. If you start to look at the sequence in which things are done, you can eliminate lots of the risk without even having to worry about how you're going to put the particular guardrails up. That's where I would imagine the solution is.
I made the comment yesterday about different constructions being separated by industry rather than engineering principles. So a scaffold with a timber deck and a frame and a fabric cover can be a stage, a dodge and track, a hospitality unit, and from an engineering point of view it doesn't make any difference, and I'm sure what you've just said applies across all industries.
Yeah.
My difficulty is trying to work out which questions I really want to ask you.
If you ask me a couple now, you can ask me some more over lunch.
We had some debate yesterday. Could you just clarify for us what the status of a BSEM is, and what our compulsion to comply with that is, and what the limits on that compulsion?
Which BSEM are you talking about?
13782.
Any BSEM. Any. What is the status of an EM requirement, especially if that?
You mean in terms of where we would place it when we're looking at as a benchmark standard?
Yes, or whether one can vary from that and use your own risk assessment.
None of them are legal requirements.
Thank you. Secondly, and this is we sat on a panel back in February last year, which you may or may not have expunged from your memory, where I suggested that the new arrangements may result in a vacuum or a lack of inspection and enforcement, which I think a lot of people in this room actually would fear more than over-enforcement, because you're probably talking to a room that are converted here. So is there the possibility that, given the limited resources of the HSE and the fact you haven't got an inspector in every parish, is there a possibility that some of these enforcement duties that you say have now devolved back to the HSE might get re-tasked to the local authority, or are we in a situation where actually during the construction and dismantling phases we're going to have far less regulation and far less opportunity to intersect with inspectors to get the sort of thing that John was asking about, what's a good and acceptable level of practice? Are we facing a situation of less regulation in this new environment?
I would question whether there was a high level of regulation in relation to the safety of the people doing the work before anyway. My experience, even some of the local authorities in London who have great experience in it because they've got lots of events, the level of enforcement action they were taking on the issues around edge protection were minimal, if not non-existent, which is why it's still an issue for the industry. The advantage of having the HSE involved is you have a national organisation with all of the resources and the backup and the standard setting and all the other things all in one place. So now the problem has been highlighted, we'll have to move to a solution. So those problems will be solved. Like, you know, whether some will take longer, some will be quite quick, quite easy to do, but they will be solved. In terms of the amount of inspectors on the ground that you see, local authority inspectors will still be there looking at licensing issues and looking at the event itself. And they have all been asked to tell us about things they spot that they think we should know about. And those concerns are fast-tracked through to our construction teams. So if there is a particular issue, they can get in touch with someone and we can send a compliance officer or inspector out to site to deal with it. Very much in the way that we do with the building control officers on normal construction sites. Because the ratio of inspectors to construction sites is probably worse than it is between inspectors and event sites. Far worse. But we use lots of different sources of intelligence to target our work. So we don't have an approach to inspection like HSE would have had when I joined 20-something years ago. It was about routine inspection, and we would judge how good you were and then how often we should come back as a result of our inspection activity. We draw our intelligence from lots of different sources to target the poor performers. So, for example, one of the things we do with the construction industry on a regional level with smaller regional contractors is each team has 10 contractors on a list who are poor performers and need improving. And over a period of 2 years, they have to help improve those contractors or they go to court. Or maybe they potentially go to court at the beginning of that process and the middle and the end as well. So we target the people who need the attention. We leave the people who are better alone. We don't spend our time looking at the top tier of contractors in the construction industry on a proactive level. We do it reactively still. We have particular problems, whether there's an accident investigation or a complaint. We don't spend lots and lots of time looking at those companies. We don't do hundreds of visits across the whole country to very good performers. We spend our time with the poor performers.
One of the issues that was highlighted yesterday to a great level and to an extent at the working group and in other forums over the winter is this question of competency and the fact that the events industry traditionally use people that don't have formal qualifications. And I'm just wondering where we could get some guidance to point the industry in the right way to establish those competencies and establish qualifications for the people who have obviously got the skills.
I'm not going to pretend that the competence issue in construction is all tickety-boo and running smoothly. It's a very difficult area. The requirement for competence specifically in construction first came in 2007 with CDM regs. And that has assisted the sort of explosion of card schemes. That's one example of competence in inverted commas. Some of those card schemes, like the construction plant operators scheme, in order to have a card, you've got to have achieved an NVQ standard. You can't renew unless you're at that standard. So that is a proper competence card of people demonstrating competence at a specified level with national occupational standards and all the rest of it. But at the other end, you can have a day's training on putting up a particular piece of kit and get a card that says you're competent, and actually you're not, you've been trained. So competence is not an easy issue.
No, it's not.
And we are very clear in HSE that we don't see having a card as being the only demonstration of competence.
No, I had a discussion with Jumbo last night, who's got an enormous amount of experience putting stages up. And I said to him, if you sat down with a crew member, you could find out in about 15 minutes whether he was any good or not, and probably 5 minutes if he was on site. So it's not a question of knowledge about competence, but it's a question of proving it in documentation. And how we can establish training schemes, who's going to pay for it, where do we go? I know there's lots of funding available for training, but because we've never traditionally, I mean, PSA have had some schemes going, UTA have got their MVQ system going, but there is a big area out there, particularly with the larger structures and the stages, where there is no formal qualification of stage master or tent master.
The construction industry, construction skills are the primary body in terms of competence in the construction industry, although there are other sector skills councils that impinge on construction. We did some joint research with them 2 years ago, which was released last year, called the High-Tech report, which the company did the research, which looked at the whole of the picture of competence across the industry and what particular problems were. one of the recommendations for that was a card registration authority. Now that isn't something for HSE to take forward, that's something for the industry to take forward. I think you will see in construction a lot of the lessons of how it's gone wrong being learned and being remedied over the next year or two. There were issues around some of the card schemes that were sort of political issues that being ironed out, which maybe couldn't progress the issue much over the last 12 months. But I think you will see an industry learning the lessons of how not to do it and how it should be done. But maybe through our JACE working group, we can pick up on and help guide the industry. But it wouldn't be something HSE would lead. It would be something we expect the industry to take on for itself.
Who builds the cap?
Gavin, I'm just picking up Tim's point about the gap, which I think exists. If I take any festival, we've got 3 week build and 2 week takedown. Historically, we've had a visit pretty much every day from the local authority. Because HSE were involved in the TDS, we really didn't get that. So we're missing 3 weeks of visits and another 2 weeks at the end where they maybe come every other day and watch what we're doing. I think that's going to be duplicated because local authorities are looking to cut back on their expenditure on festivals. If it's a non-licensable thing, and they're really concerned for the licence, apart from provision documentation, they're really concerned just about the running of the event. So there's a whole 3 week build with a 10 days, 1 week takedown, 2 week takedown, which we're not getting any business for. And I think most of us in this room, as Tim said, very much in favour of enforcement, in favour of legislation. But some people do need to have the stick rather than the carrot. I think that that there's a lack of stick potentially, particularly now if you're looking at not doing major events, very confident about major events being run properly, and you're looking at smaller events. That means that the local authorities would think, actually, I don't have to bother because the HSE are taking on this, and we do structures. It's their problem. So there is a danger that there's a hole which was filled by the local authority.
Our analysis of the activity, the enforcement activity undertaken by local authorities predating the enforcing authority change it was a drop in the ocean, tiny amount of enforcement activity. Very few notices, very few prosecutions only when there'd been something horrendous that had gone wrong, and even then sometimes there were not prosecutions. So were these people inspecting the sites to look at the health and safety aspects of what was happening, or the actual event that was being put on? That
No, it's the build periods, and they are as occupational health and safety professionals from usually the environmental health section of the local authority. They would visit on several sites, not just Reading, on a daily basis. It wouldn't necessarily involve an enforcement notice, but their presence and the fact that they would do a report form and they would give us things that we need to improve was actually a bit of a stick, a bit of a carrot maybe for us to keep things moving in the right direction. And the danger of it, is this what you're saying, Tim? Is that that's now been taken away. And we're very responsible, I think, as a client. But from other lesser festivals, maybe other festivals, there's nobody bothering, and it's much more self-policing, which I'm not against, but we've just removed that safety factor, which no local authority would come on site, often unannounced, often just people would know they were coming, kept people on their toes a bit, and we've lost that.
I would take you back to the start of the construction programme actually, because that approach of waiting for the HSE to come around and the safety advisor being given some ammunition to use against the principal contractor on the construction site or the client, say we've got to do this because HSE said we've got to do it, even though it's well known we've got to do it. That was pretty much where the construction industry was in the 90s. Now, that is not the case with the major players. The large sites, the large contractors do not behave like that. There's a totally different way they behave. I remember as an inspector in the 90s, I inspected things like the Channel Tunnel for 18 months, arguing with people on the Channel Tunnel about whether they should do this, whether they should do that, whether they should do the other, even though it was clearly what the legislation required. And that's having to take enforcement action against them. Now I go to the UKCG, United Kingdom Contractors Group meeting, it's the 35 biggest contractors in the country, and they've pushed far beyond what we're doing. They've gone beyond compliance, and it's not just safety advisors, it's the chief executive of Waits, chief executive of Alpha Beatty. They want their industry to be exemplary. They're looking now towards zero harm, in the same way that the chemical industry would have been doing 20, 30 years ago. The industry has changed. Relying on regulators to tell you how to manage your job is not how to improve an industry. The way to improve it is to bring the industry together, agree the standards, and then where enforcement action and inspection can be best targeted in terms of the poorest performance and also the biggest impact on the wider scale, that's how you change an industry.
With respect, Gavin, that's not the point, because I think those of us that are working at scale and with contractors and clients and suppliers in whom we have confidence, we are adopting exactly what we said. The industry is leading and being ahead of the game. But a lot of people in here are working in an environment, commercial environment, where they are trying to differentiate their good practice from the cowboys. There's always someone who will sell a cheaper product, getting a seasonal crew, whatever, and undercut them. And it's not a question of like, how do we regulate the good guys? It's a question of how do the good guys actually manage to maintain that commercial advantage of doing it right, because the inspection is falling away and there's no stick to hit the cowboys with.
I agree, you do need an element of the stick, but I think that the point about working with the industry is that you are working with the clients as well. You are looking at the whole procurement chain, because some of the decisions that affect what happens on the site are often taken months. Probably the timescales are smaller in the events industry than would be in construction, but a long time before the first person turns up on the site. So us targeting the whole of that procurement chain that's what has improved the construction industry. It's worked in an industry that was extremely resistant to change in the 80s and 90s. It was killing 200 people a year in 1990. It's worked there. It's our experience. It's worked in other sectors as well. It's working now in the waste industry, which again is